Unlike his mentor Sigmund Freud, who viewed religion as a collective neurosis and illusion, Jung discovered something entirely different in his clinical work. He found that religious experience was not pathological, but essential to human psychological health and development. Through decades of treating patients, analyzing thousands of dreams, and studying mythologies from around the world, Jung uncovered patterns that would challenge everything psychology thought it knew about religion. He discovered that the human psyche has a natural religious function, as fundamental as breathing or eating. His patients, regardless of their conscious beliefs or cultural backgrounds, consistently produced dreams and fantasies filled with religious imagery and sacred symbols. Even the most atheistic and rational individuals seemed to have an unconscious spiritual dimension that demanded expression. Jung's approach was radically empirical. He did not start with theological assumptions or philosophical theories about God. Instead, he observed what actually happened in the human psyche when people encountered the sacred. What he found was that religious experience emerges from the deepest layers of the unconscious mind, from what he called the collective unconscious, a realm of universal patterns and images shared by all humanity. This discovery had profound implications. It meant that spirituality was not imposed on humans from the outside by culture or tradition, but arose spontaneously from within the psyche itself. Religion, in Jung's understanding, was the natural expression of psychological processes that seek wholeness, meaning, and connection with something greater than the individual ego. This insight would transform both psychology and religious studies, offering a new way to understand why humans are universally drawn to spiritual experience and how these experiences contribute to psychological development and healing. Part 1. The religious function of the psyche. Jung's most fundamental insight about religion emerged from careful observation of his patients over many years of clinical practice. He noticed that individuals who had lost connection with religious or spiritual meaning consistently showed signs of psychological disturbance. Conversely, those who maintained some form of relationship with the sacred, whether through traditional religion or personal spiritual practice, demonstrated greater resilience and psychological health. This led him to propose that humans possess what he called a religious function, an innate psychological mechanism as powerful and fundamental as the drives for survival, reproduction, or social connection. The religious function, according to Jung, operates independently of conscious beliefs or cultural conditioning. Even individuals who consciously reject all forms of religion still manifest this function through their unconscious processes. Jung observed that such people often developed substitute religions, whether in the form of political ideologies, scientific materialism, or devotion to secular causes that took on quasi-religious characteristics. The psyche, he concluded, cannot function optimally without some form of relationship to what he called the Numinous, the mysterious and awe-inspiring dimension of existence that transcends ordinary understanding. Jung distinguished carefully between religion and creed. Creeds, he argued, are collective belief systems, codified and dogmatized forms of original religious experience. They represent attempts by institutions to capture and transmit spiritual insights across generations. While creeds can be valuable, they often become rigid and lose connection with the living experience that originally inspired them. Religion, by contrast, Jung defined as a subjective relationship to certain metaphysical factors, a personal encounter with powers or presences that feel greater than the individual self. This distinction allowed him to study religious phenomena without becoming entangled in theological debates about the truth or falsity of particular doctrines. The religious function manifests in multiple ways throughout human development. In childhood, it often appears through fascination with stories of magic, heroes, and otherworldly beings. These tales, found in every culture, serve as vehicles for archetypal content that helps children develop their sense of meaning and purpose. In adolescence, the religious function frequently emerges through questioning of inherited beliefs and search for personal spiritual identity. Young people often experience intense spiritual longings or mystical states as their psyche seeks to establish connection with sources of meaning beyond family and social expectations. In adulthood, the religious function continues to operate through dreams, synchronistic experiences, encounters with art and nature, and times of crisis that demand deeper resources for coping and understanding. Jung observed that when the religious function is suppressed or denied, psychological symptoms often emerge. These might include depression, anxiety, a sense of meaninglessness, compulsive behaviors, or what he called neurosis. The psyche, deprived of its natural spiritual dimension, begins to malfunction. Conversely, when individuals cultivate relationship with the numinous through whatever means feel authentic to them, psychological healing often occurs. This did not mean Jung advocated for any particular religious practice or belief system. Rather, he emphasized that each person must find their own way of relating to the sacred dimension of existence. The religious function also serves a regulatory role in psychological development. Jung discovered that the unconscious psyche naturally produces compensatory images and experiences that balance one-sided conscious attitudes. If someone becomes too rational and materialistic, they might have dreams of angels or mystical visions. If someone becomes too otherworldly and detached from practical life, they might dream of earthy, grounding symbols. The religious function helps maintain psychological equilibrium by ensuring that all dimensions of human experience receive appropriate attention. This regulatory aspect explains why religious imagery appears so frequently in dreams and fantasies, even among people who consciously reject spiritual concerns. Jung's understanding of the religious function was based on extensive cross-cultural research. He studied religions from around the world and throughout history, finding remarkable similarities in their core concerns and symbolic expressions. All traditions, he discovered, address fundamental questions about the meaning of life, the nature of suffering, the possibility of transformation, and relationship with transcendent reality. All develop practices for cultivating spiritual experience and wisdom. All use symbols and rituals to connect individuals with larger patterns of meaning. These universals suggested to Jung that religious phenomena arise from shared structures in the human psyche rather than from historical accidents or cultural inventions. This insight had radical implications for understanding human nature itself. If the religious function is indeed fundamental to psychological health, then purely secular approaches to human development and healing are necessarily incomplete. Psychology, Jung argued, must take seriously the spiritual dimension of human experience if it hopes to understand the full range of psychological phenomena. This did not mean that psychology should become theology, but rather that it should develop sophisticated ways of studying religious experience without reducing it to pathology or dismissing it as illusion. Jung's approach opened new possibilities for dialogue between psychology and religion. Rather than seeing these domains as necessarily conflicting, he suggested they could be complementary ways of exploring human experience. Psychology could help illuminate the inner processes involved in spiritual development, while religious traditions could offer wisdom about the ultimate questions that give life meaning and direction. This collaborative approach has influenced generations of therapists, clergy and scholars who seek to integrate psychological and spiritual perspectives in their work with individuals seeking healing and growth. Part 2. The collective unconscious and sacred patterns. Jung's discovery of the collective unconscious fundamentally transformed our understanding of where religious experience originates. Through years of analysing dreams, fantasies and the symbolic productions of his patients, Jung noticed that certain images and themes appeared repeatedly across individuals who had no cultural connection to each other. A Swiss businessman might dream of Hindu deities he had never encountered, while a rural farmer might produce mandalas resembling Tibetan Buddhist art. These observations led Jung to propose that beneath our personal unconscious lies a deeper layer of the psyche shared by all humanity. The collective unconscious differs fundamentally from personal memory or learned cultural knowledge. It consists of what Jung called primordial images or archetypes, universal patterns that have existed throughout human history and appear spontaneously in the psyche of every individual. These patterns are not inherited as specific content, but rather as forms or potentials that become activated when individuals encounter relevant life situations. Just as humans are born with the potential to develop language, but must learn specific languages through experience, we are born with archetypal potentials that manifest through particular cultural and personal experiences. Religious traditions, Jung discovered, are essentially collective expressions of archetypal content emerging from the collective unconscious. The great myths, symbols and rituals that appear across cultures represent humanity's attempt to give form to these deep psychological patterns. Creation stories, flood narratives, dying and rising god myths, virgin birth accounts and apocalyptic visions appear in traditions that had no historical contact with each other. This suggests they arise from shared psychological structures rather than cultural borrowing or historical influence. The collective unconscious explains why religious symbols have such powerful emotional impact even for people unfamiliar with their traditional meanings. When someone encounters a cross, a lotus flower, a sacred mountain, or an image of divine light, they may feel moved in ways they cannot rationally explain. The symbol activates archetypal content in their psyche, connecting them with patterns of meaning that transcend their personal experience. This is why religious art and architecture from foreign cultures can still evoke profound responses, and why certain symbols appear repeatedly in the dreams and visions of individuals seeking spiritual meaning. Jung observed that the collective unconscious operates according to its own laws, different from those governing conscious thought. While consciousness follows logical, linear patterns, the unconscious thinks in symbols, paradoxes, and timeless connections. Religious language reflects this symbolic mode of awareness through its use of metaphor, myth, and ritual rather than literal description. When religious texts speak of God as both father and mother, or describe divine love as both merciful and wrathful, they are expressing the paradoxical nature of archetypal content that cannot be captured in purely rational terms. The activation of collective unconscious material often occurs during times of crisis, transition, or spiritual seeking. When individuals face death, serious illness, major life changes, or profound questions about meaning, the psyche spontaneously produces compensatory images from the collective unconscious. These might appear as healing dreams, synchronistic events, sudden insights, or encounters with sacred presences. Such experiences often feel more real and significant than ordinary conscious experiences, carrying what Jung called a numinous quality that transforms the individual's understanding of themselves and reality. Jung's research revealed that different archetypal patterns tend to activate at different stages of psychological development. In youth, hero archetypes predominate, inspiring individuals to leave home, face challenges, and establish their identity in the world. In midlife, death and rebirth archetypes often emerge, leading to spiritual crisis and transformation. In later life, wise, elder, and transcendent unity archetypes may activate, promoting integration and preparation for life's completion. Religious traditions recognize these developmental patterns through their life cycle rituals, initiation ceremonies, and age-appropriate spiritual practices. What appears as religious doctrine often reflects psychological wisdom about the natural unfolding of archetypal content throughout human development. The collective unconscious also explains the persistence of religious experience across historical periods and cultural changes. Even in highly secular societies, archetypal content continues to emerge through various channels. Popular culture, political movements, artistic expressions, and even scientific theories often carry archetypal themes originally expressed through religious symbols. The hero's journey structure underlying countless films and novels, the quest for technological salvation, the vision of human perfectibility through social progress, all reflect archetypal patterns traditionally expressed through religious narratives. Jung emphasized that the collective unconscious is not a relic from humanity's primitive past, but a living reality that continues to influence contemporary psychological life. Modern individuals who lose connection with traditional religious forms may still access archetypal content through dreams, artistic inspiration, encounters with nature, or profound human relationships. The challenge for contemporary culture, Jung argued, is developing new forms of symbolic expression that allow archetypal content to emerge in ways relevant to modern consciousness. This might involve recovering appreciation for ritual and ceremony, cultivating practices that access non-rational modes of awareness, or creating new forms of art and literature that give expression to timeless spiritual themes. Part 3. Archetypes as universal religious symbols. Archetypes represent Jung's most significant contribution to understanding the universal nature of religious symbolism. These are not learned cultural patterns or historical artifacts, but structural elements of the psyche itself that give rise to similar religious images across all human societies. Jung identified numerous archetypal patterns that appear consistently in religious traditions worldwide, each carrying specific psychological meanings and serving particular functions in human development. Understanding these archetypal foundations helps explain why certain religious symbols have endured for millennia and continue to resonate with contemporary individuals seeking spiritual meaning. The mother archetype manifests in religious traditions through goddesses, virgin mothers, and nurturing divine figures. From the Virgin Mary in Christianity to Kuan Yin in Buddhism to the Hindu goddess Durga, cultures worldwide have created images of divine feminine figures who offer protection, compassion, and unconditional love. These figures emerge from deep psychological needs for security, nourishment, and acceptance that begin in earliest infancy but continue throughout life. When individuals encounter personal or collective trauma, mother archetype images often appear in dreams and visions, offering psychological healing and restoration. The power of these symbols transcends specific theological beliefs, touching universal human experiences of vulnerability and the need for nurturing care. Even individuals raised in patriarchal religious traditions may spontaneously encounter divine mother figures during times of crisis or spiritual seeking. The father archetype appears through images of wise kings, lawgivers, creator gods, and divine authority figures. Zeus, Odin, Yahweh, and similar figures represent the archetypal pattern of divine masculine energy that provides structure, guidance, and moral authority. This archetype serves crucial psychological functions related to developing personal identity, moral conscience, and capacity for decisive action. Healthy relationship with father archetype energy enables individuals to take responsibility for their lives, establish appropriate boundaries, and contribute to their communities. However, when this archetype becomes dominant or distorted, it can manifest as rigid authoritarianism, harsh judgment, or oppressive control. Religious traditions that exclusively emphasize divine father imagery may produce psychological imbalances that require compensation through other archetypal patterns. The hero archetype drives the universal religious theme of spiritual quest and transformation. From Buddha's journey to enlightenment to Christ's death and resurrection to the shamanic vision quest, religious traditions worldwide celebrate individuals who undergo ordeals to achieve spiritual breakthrough. This archetype reflects the psychological process by which individuals separate from unconscious identification with family and culture, face their deepest fears and limitations, and emerge with expanded consciousness and capacity to serve others. The hero's journey appears not only in religious narratives, but also in the dreams and fantasies of contemporary individuals navigating major life transitions. Adolescents leaving home, adults changing careers, or anyone facing serious illness may find themselves living out heroic patterns as they struggle to transform their identity and understanding. Religious rituals of initiation, confirmation, and ordination formalize these archetypal processes, providing cultural support for psychological transformation. The wise old man and wise old woman archetypes manifest through spiritual teachers, prophets, and guides who possess transcendent wisdom. Figures like Lao Tzu, Sophia, Merlin, and countless gurus and saints represent the archetypal pattern of wisdom that emerges from integration of life experience and spiritual insight. These figures appear in religious traditions as sources of guidance for those seeking deeper understanding. Psychologically, they represent the potential for wisdom that develops through facing life's challenges with consciousness and learning from both success and failure. In dreams and active imagination, wise old man or woman figures often appear during times when individuals need guidance about important decisions or deeper understanding of their life's meaning. The appearance of such figures indicates that the psyche is accessing its own wisdom potential, though this wisdom may initially feel like it comes from external sources. The trickster archetype appears in religious traditions through figures like Coyote, Hermes, Loki, and various divine fools and holy madmen. These figures disrupt conventional order, challenge established authorities, and reveal hidden truths through humor, paradox, and unconventional behavior. The trickster serves the crucial psychological function of preventing spiritual life from becoming too rigid, serious, or disconnected from instinctual vitality. Religious traditions that lack trickster elements may become overly moralistic and lose their capacity for joy, creativity, and adaptive change. Conversely, trickster energy without appropriate containers may lead to spiritual bypassing, where individuals use humor and irreverence to avoid genuine spiritual discipline and commitment. Healthy spirituality requires balance between reverent seriousness and playful irreverence, both of which serve essential functions in psychological and spiritual development. The death and rebirth archetype underlies the universal religious themes of sacrifice, resurrection, and spiritual transformation. Dying and rising god figures like Osiris, Dionysus, and Christ represent the psychological process by which old forms of identity must die for new consciousness to emerge. This archetype manifests not only in religious mythology, but also in the actual psychological experiences of individuals undergoing spiritual transformation. Mystical traditions worldwide recognize that genuine spiritual development requires the death of ego identification and rebirth into expanded awareness. Religious rituals of baptism, vision quests, and meditation practices often facilitate encounter with death and rebirth archetypal energy. Contemporary individuals may encounter this archetype during midlife crises, near-death experiences, or profound meditation practices that dissolve ordinary self-boundaries and reveal deeper levels of identity. The self-archetype represents the most comprehensive archetypal pattern, manifesting through images of divine unity, cosmic consciousness, and ultimate spiritual realization. Mandalas, sacred mountains, world trees, and images of divine light or radiance all point toward the self-archetype as the goal of spiritual development. This archetype represents the potential for psychological wholeness that emerges through integration of all other archetypal patterns and conscious relationship with the totality of the psyche. Religious traditions worldwide recognize this ultimate spiritual goal through various names such as enlightenment, salvation, or union with God. The self-archetype serves as both the source and goal of religious seeking, providing the energy that motivates spiritual development while also representing its ultimate fulfillment. However, Jung warned against premature identification with self-archetype energy, which can lead to spiritual inflation and grandiose delusions rather than genuine integration and wisdom. Part 4. The Numinous Experience and Rudolf Otto's Influence. Jung's understanding of religious experience was profoundly shaped by his encounter with the work of German theologian Rudolf Otto, whose concept of the numinous provided a crucial bridge between psychology and religious studies. Otto had identified a distinctive quality of religious experience that could not be reduced to moral, aesthetic, or rational categories. The numinous, Otto argued, was the wholly experienced as mysterium tremendum et fascinans, a mystery that is both terrifying and fascinating, repelling and attracting simultaneously. This concept gave Jung a precise psychological vocabulary for describing the overwhelming emotional impact that accompanies encounter with archetypal content emerging from the collective unconscious. Otto's analysis of numinous experience identified several key characteristics that Jung found invaluable for his psychological work. The element of mysterium refers to the wholly other quality of divine encounter, the sense that one is facing something completely beyond ordinary human categories of understanding. This corresponds psychologically to the emergence of unconscious content that transcends the ego's normal frame of reference. When archetypal material activates in the psyche, individuals often feel they are encountering something alien, yet strangely familiar, foreign, yet intimately connected to their deepest nature. The mystery aspect explains why religious experience so often involves paradox and symbolic language rather than literal description. The psyche uses metaphor and symbol to point toward realities that exceed the capacity of rational thought to encompass. The tremendum aspect of numinous experience refers to its awesome, overwhelming, and sometimes terrifying quality. Religious traditions worldwide recognize that authentic encounter with the sacred often produces fear, trembling, and a profound sense of human limitation in the face of infinite power. Psychologically, this tremendum quality reflects the ego's recognition that it is not the center of the psyche, that much larger forces are at work within the personality. When individuals encounter archetypal content directly, they may feel overwhelmed by energies beyond their conscious control. Dreams of overwhelming natural forces, encounters with divine figures of immense power, or mystical experiences of cosmic consciousness all carry this tremendum quality that can be both transformative and destabilizing. Jung observed that the therapeutic process often involves helping individuals develop sufficient ego strength to encounter numinous content without being overwhelmed or inflated by it. The fascinance element describes the irresistible attraction that draws individuals toward numinous encounter despite its potentially overwhelming nature. Religious seekers throughout history have described being pulled toward spiritual experience by forces they cannot resist or fully understand. This fascinating quality explains why individuals willingly undergo spiritual disciplines, mystical practices, and religious commitments that may involve considerable sacrifice and difficulty. From a psychological perspective, the fascinans represents the natural attraction of consciousness toward wholeness and integration. The psyche has an inherent drive toward completion that manifests as spiritual longing, creative inspiration, and the search for meaning. Even individuals who consciously reject religious involvement may find themselves fascinated by spiritual themes in art, literature, or philosophical inquiry. Jung discovered that numinous experiences often emerge spontaneously during periods of psychological crisis or transition. When ordinary conscious structures prove inadequate for dealing with life challenges, the unconscious may produce compensatory experiences carrying numinous intensity. These might appear as dramatic dreams, synchronistic events, encounters with spiritual presences, or sudden insights that reorganize the individual's entire understanding of reality. Such experiences serve a crucial psychological function by providing access to resources and perspectives beyond those available to ordinary consciousness. However, Jung also recognized that numinous experiences could be psychologically dangerous if individuals lack sufficient ego development to integrate them appropriately. Premature or uncontained encounter with archetypal energies might lead to psychotic episodes, inflation, or destructive identification with unconscious contents. The therapeutic implications of understanding numinous experience were central to Jung's analytical psychology. He observed that many psychological symptoms reflected the absence or distortion of numinous experience in individuals' lives. Depression, anxiety, addictions, and various forms of neurosis often accompanied spiritual emptiness or disconnection from sources of meaning that transcend personal concerns. Conversely, psychological healing frequently involved restoring access to numinous experience through dreams, active imagination, artistic expression, or engagement with religious or spiritual practices. Jung developed therapeutic techniques specifically designed to facilitate safe encounter with archetypal content while maintaining ego stability and critical discrimination. This approach required therapists to take spiritual dimensions of experience seriously without becoming religious advocates or losing psychological objectivity. Jung's appropriation of Otto's numinous concept also influenced his understanding of religious development throughout the lifespan. He observed that numinous experiences tend to cluster around certain developmental periods, particularly adolescence, midlife, and later years when individuals face fundamental questions about identity and meaning. Young people often report intense spiritual experiences as they separate from childhood dependencies and seek their own relationship with ultimate reality. Midlife frequently brings encounters with mortality and limitation that activate archetypal content related to death, rebirth, and spiritual transformation. Older adults may experience numinous encounters that facilitate acceptance of life's completion and preparation for death. Understanding these natural developmental patterns helped Jung normalize spiritual experience and recognize its crucial role in psychological maturation. The numinous quality also characterizes the therapeutic relationship itself, when genuine psychological transformation occurs. Jung observed that effective therapy often involves moments of numinous encounter between therapist and patient that transcend ordinary interpersonal interaction. These might manifest as shared recognition of archetypal patterns, synchronistic events that illuminate psychological dynamics, or emergence of symbolic material that carries transformative power for both participants. Such experiences indicate that the therapeutic process has activated archetypal energies that promote healing and integration. However, Jung emphasized that therapists must maintain appropriate boundaries and professional objectivity even when encountering numinous dimensions of the therapeutic relationship. The goal is not mystical union, but psychological differentiation that enables both therapist and patient to relate consciously to archetypal contents without being overwhelmed or inflated by them. Part 5. Jung's break with Freud over religion. The intellectual and personal rupture between Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud fundamentally shaped the development of depth psychology and established two opposing approaches to understanding religious experience. Their disagreement over religion revealed deeper philosophical differences about human nature, the structure of the psyche, and the role of spirituality in psychological health. While Freud viewed religion as a collective neurosis requiring therapeutic dissolution, Jung came to see religious experience as natural, necessary, and potentially therapeutic. This fundamental disagreement ultimately led to their personal estrangement and the establishment of analytical psychology as a distinct alternative to psychoanalysis. Freud's approach to religion was consistently reductionist, viewing spiritual beliefs and practices as expressions of unconscious sexual and aggressive drives. In works like The Future of an Illusion and Civilization and Its Discontents, Freud argued that religion represents humanity's infantile response to helplessness in the face of natural forces and social constraints. Religious beliefs, from this perspective, are collective wish fulfillments that provide false comfort by projecting parental figures onto the cosmos. God represents an idealized father figure who offers protection and guidance that mature individuals should outgrow through rational understanding and scientific progress. Freud expected that as humanity developed psychologically and scientifically, religious beliefs would naturally disappear, replaced by rational approaches to managing human problems. His therapeutic approach aimed to dissolve religious attachments by revealing their unconscious psychological origins and helping patients develop more realistic relationships with external reality. Jung initially accepted Freudian interpretations of religious phenomena, but his clinical experience gradually led him to question this reductionist approach. He observed that patients who lost religious faith often developed psychological symptoms, while those who maintained some form of spiritual practice showed greater resilience and capacity for healing. More significantly, Jung noticed that religious imagery appeared spontaneously in the dreams and fantasies of patients who had no conscious religious interests. These observations suggested that religious content emerged from deep psychological structures rather than cultural conditioning or neurotic conflicts. Jung began to suspect that Freud's sexual theory, while illuminating certain aspects of human psychology, was too narrow to account for the full range of psychological phenomena, particularly those related to meaning, purpose, and spiritual development. This growing divergence from orthodox psychoanalytic theory created increasing tension in his relationship with Freud, who expected loyalty to his theoretical framework from all members of the psychoanalytic movement. The personal dynamics between Jung and Freud complicated their theoretical disagreements about religion. Freud had hoped that Jung, as a non-Jewish analyst from a prominent Swiss family, would help legitimize psychoanalysis and protect it from accusations of being a Jewish science. Jung's Christian background and social connections made him valuable to the psychoanalytic movement's expansion beyond its Viennese Jewish origins. However, these same factors also contributed to their eventual split, as Jung's cultural background included elements that Freud found incompatible with scientific rationalism. Jung's interest in occultism, mythology and religious symbolism struck Freud as regression to primitive thinking rather than legitimate scientific investigation. Their correspondence reveals Freud's growing concern that Jung was abandoning scientific rigor in favor of mystical speculation, while Jung felt increasingly constrained by what he saw as Freud's materialism and theoretical rigidity. The theoretical breaking point came with Jung's publication of Psychology of the Unconscious in 1912, later revised as Symbols of Transformation. In this work, Jung challenged Freud's sexual theory by proposing that libido should be understood as general psychic energy rather than specifically sexual energy. More provocatively, Jung argued that religious symbols could not be reduced to sexual symbolism, but represented autonomous psychological phenomena with their own developmental significance. He suggested that mythological and religious imagery reflected universal patterns in the human psyche that served crucial functions in psychological development and cultural evolution. This theoretical innovation directly contradicted Freudian doctrine and implied that religious experience might be psychologically beneficial rather than pathological. Freud recognized that Jung's revisionist approach threatened the theoretical foundations of psychoanalysis and responded with increasing criticism and eventual rejection of his former protégé. Jung's development of the collective unconscious concept further widened the gap between his approach and Freudian psychoanalysis. While Freud's unconscious was primarily personal, consisting of repressed individual experiences, Jung proposed a deeper layer of unconscious material shared by all humanity. This collective unconscious contained archetypal patterns that manifested through religious symbols, mythological narratives, and spiritual experiences across cultures. From this perspective, religion was not a cultural artifact or neurotic symptom, but a natural expression of universal psychological structures. Religious traditions represented humanity's collective wisdom about psychological development, offering symbolic frameworks for understanding life's challenges and possibilities. This radical reconceptualization of religion's psychological significance placed Jung in fundamental opposition to Freudian reductionism and established the theoretical foundation for analytical psychology's positive approach to spiritual experience. The personal cost of their theoretical disagreement was significant for both men. Freud experienced Jung's defection as a profound betrayal, not only of personal loyalty, but of the scientific principles he believed essential for psychology's development. He worried that Jung's mystical interest would discredit psychoanalysis and return psychology to the pre-scientific speculations it had struggled to overcome. For Jung, the break represented liberation from theoretical constraints that prevented full exploration of psychological phenomena, but also isolation from the psychoanalytic community that had provided intellectual stimulation and professional support. The personal pain of their estrangement lasted for years and influenced both men's subsequent theoretical developments. Freud became more rigid in defending orthodox psychoanalytic doctrine, while Jung emphasized the importance of individual theoretical development and resistance to dogmatic adherence to any psychological school. The long-term implications of their split shaped the entire field of depth psychology and influenced how subsequent generations understood the relationship between psychology and religion. Freudian psychoanalysis remained predominantly secular and reductionist, viewing religious beliefs and practices with suspicion and seeking to dissolve them through therapeutic analysis. Jungian analytical psychology developed as an alternative approach that took religious experience seriously and sought to understand its psychological significance without reducing it to pathology. This divergence created space for dialogue between psychology and religious traditions that would have been impossible within a purely Freudian framework. Contemporary approaches to psychology and spirituality continue to reflect these fundamental differences, with some schools following Freudian reductionism, while others embrace Jungian appreciation for religious experience as a legitimate and potentially beneficial dimension of human psychology. The debate initiated by Jung and Freud remains active in contemporary discussions about the role of spirituality in mental health and psychological development. Part 6. The process of individuation as spiritual journey. Individuation represents Jung's most comprehensive contribution to understanding human development, integrating psychological growth with spiritual realization in a way that transcends traditional distinctions between secular and religious approaches to human fulfillment. Jung defined individuation as the process by which an individual becomes whole, integrating conscious and unconscious elements of the psyche to achieve psychological unity and authentic self-expression. This process unfolds naturally throughout the lifespan, but requires conscious participation and often involves profound spiritual transformation. Individuation is simultaneously a psychological process observable through empirical methods and a spiritual journey comparable to the mystical paths described in religious traditions worldwide. The individuation process typically begins in earnest during what Jung called the second half of life, usually after age 35, when individuals have established themselves in the external world through career, relationships and social identity. Up to this point, psychological development focuses primarily on ego formation and adaptation to collective expectations. Young adults must develop effective personas, learn social skills, establish economic independence, and often create families or other committed relationships. These tasks require strong ego development and successful relationship with the external world. However, Jung observed that many individuals who achieve conventional success begin experiencing a sense of emptiness, meaninglessness, or restless dissatisfaction in midlife. This midlife crisis often signals the beginning of individuation proper, as the psyche shifts focus from external achievement to internal development and the search for deeper meaning. The individuation process involves systematic encounter with various archetypal contents that have remained unconscious during the first half of life. The first major confrontation typically involves what Jung called the shadow, the collection of personal and collective contents that individuals have rejected or failed to develop. Shadow work requires acknowledging unacceptable aspects of one's personality, owning projections onto others, and integrating disowned potentials. This process often feels like a descent into darkness or hell, as individuals must face their own capacity for selfishness, aggression, dishonesty, and other qualities they prefer to deny. Religious traditions recognize this necessary descent through various metaphors, such as the dark night of the soul, descent into the underworld, or confrontation with demonic forces. Successful shadow integration leads to greater authenticity, reduced projection onto others, and increased compassion for human fallibility. Following shadow work, individuation typically involves encounter with what Jung called the anima in men and animus in women, the contrasexual aspects of personality that connect individuals with the opposite gender's psychological qualities. For men, anima work involves developing receptivity, emotional sensitivity, intuition, and relationship capacity that patriarchal conditioning often suppresses. For women, animus work involves developing assertiveness, rational discrimination, goal-oriented action, and independence that traditional feminine roles may discourage. This phase of individuation often involves attraction to individuals who embody the projected contrasexual qualities, leading to passionate relationships that facilitate psychological development through projection and eventual withdrawal of projection. Religious traditions recognize this dynamic through various sacred marriage symbols, tantric practices, and mystical imagery that describes divine union as both internal psychological achievement and interpersonal spiritual practice. Successful contrasexual integration leads to psychological androgyny, the capacity to access both masculine and feminine psychological functions as appropriate to different situations. The deepest phase of individuation involves encounter with what Jung called the self, the archetype of psychological wholeness that serves as both the source and goal of the individuation process. Self-encounters often occur through numinous experiences that provide direct contact with the transpersonal dimension of the psyche. These might manifest as mystical states, profound dreams, synchronistic events, or encounters with spiritual presences that reveal dimensions of reality beyond ordinary ego consciousness. The self represents the individual's unique potential for psychological wholeness, while simultaneously connecting them with universal patterns of meaning and development. Religious traditions worldwide recognize this ultimate spiritual goal through various names such as enlightenment, salvation, self-realization, or union with God. However, Jung emphasized that individuation never involves complete identification with the self, which would lead to inflation and loss of human relatedness, but rather conscious relationship with the self as a guiding and regulating principle. The individuation process follows a natural developmental pattern that Jung observed across cultures and historical periods. Initial ego development focuses on adaptation and achievement in the external world. Midlife crisis signals the beginning of turning inward towards psychological and spiritual development. Shadow work involves confronting rejected aspects of personality and achieving greater authenticity. Contrasexual integration brings balance between masculine and feminine psychological functions. Self-encounter provides access to transpersonal meaning and guidance for life's completion. However, individuation is not a linear progression, but rather a spiral process involving repeated encounters with each archetypal level at greater depths of understanding and integration. Individuals may work with shadow material throughout their lives, continually discovering new layers of unconscious content that require conscious integration. Jung recognized that individuation cannot be achieved through purely personal effort, but requires what he called the transcendent function, the psychological mechanism that mediates between conscious and unconscious contents to produce new, creative synthesis. The transcendent function operates through various means, including dreams, active imagination, artistic expression, and engagement with symbolic material that connects conscious awareness with unconscious wisdom. Religious practices such as meditation, prayer, ritual participation, and contemplative reading often facilitate transcendent function by providing structured ways of accessing non-rational sources of guidance and insight. Jung observed that individuals who attempt individuation without spiritual resources often become stuck in neurotic conflicts or inflated identification with archetypal contents. Conversely, those who engage with religious or spiritual practices appropriate to their temperament and cultural background often find resources for navigating the challenging transitions involved in psychological transformation. This led Jung to conclude that individuation naturally involves spiritual development, though this need not take traditional religious forms. The relationship between individuation and social responsibility represents another crucial dimension of Jung's understanding of spiritual development. Authentic individuation does not lead to selfish withdrawal from collective life, but rather to more conscious and effective participation in community and cultural development. Individuals who achieve significant psychological integration often feel called to serve others through teaching, healing, creative expression, or social action informed by their expanded awareness. Religious traditions recognize this dynamic through concepts such as the bodhisattva ideal in Buddhism, which emphasizes that enlightenment naturally expresses itself through compassionate service to all beings. Jung observed that genuinely individuated persons often become cultural innovators, spiritual teachers, or healing professionals who help others navigate their own developmental challenges. The ultimate goal of individuation is not personal fulfillment, but contribution to the ongoing evolution of human consciousness through individual transformation that serves collective healing and development. Part 7. Dreams and Religious Imagery. Jung's revolutionary approach to dream interpretation fundamentally transformed understanding of how religious experience manifests through unconscious processes. Unlike Freud, who viewed dreams primarily as disguised expressions of repressed sexual and aggressive wishes, Jung discovered that dreams often contain explicitly religious imagery that serves crucial functions in psychological and spiritual development. Through analysis of thousands of dreams from patients of diverse cultural and religious backgrounds, Jung documented the spontaneous emergence of sacred symbols, divine figures, and mystical experiences that could not be reduced to personal conflicts or cultural conditioning. These observations led him to conclude that the psyche possesses an inherent religious function that operates independently of conscious beliefs or religious education. Religious imagery in dreams often appears during periods of psychological crisis or transition when conscious resources prove inadequate for managing life challenges. Jung observed that individuals facing serious illness, death of loved ones, career changes, or major life decisions frequently report dreams containing divine figures, sacred places, or mystical symbols that provide guidance and comfort unavailable through ordinary consciousness. These dreams serve a compensatory function, offering perspectives and resources that balance the limitations of ego consciousness. A person overwhelmed by rational analysis might dream of angels or divine light, while someone lost in emotional chaos might receive dreams of wise teachers or sacred texts that provide clarity and direction. The religious imagery emerges spontaneously from the unconscious to address specific psychological needs and promote healing and integration. Such dreams often feel more real and significant than ordinary dreams, carrying what Jung called numinous intensity that transforms the dreamer's understanding of their situation and possibilities. The archetypal nature of religious dream imagery explains why similar symbols appear across cultures in the dreams of individuals with no conscious knowledge of their traditional meanings. A Christian might dream of Buddhist mandalas, while a secular person might encounter Hindu deities or Islamic calligraphy. These cross-cultural appearances suggest that religious symbols emerge from universal archetypal patterns, rather than personal religious education or cultural exposure. Jung documented numerous cases of patients whose dreams contained accurate details of religious traditions they had never studied, indicating access to what he called the collective unconscious. Such dreams often prove highly meaningful to the dreamers despite their unfamiliarity with the symbol's traditional interpretations. The archetypal dimension of religious imagery allows it to convey universal meanings about psychological and spiritual development that transcend specific cultural formulations while still speaking to individual circumstances and needs. Jung identified several categories of religious dreams that serve different functions in psychological development. Compensatory dreams provide alternative perspectives that balance conscious attitudes, such as mystical visions that counter excessive rationalism or practical guidance that grounds otherworldly tendencies. Prospective dreams offer glimpses of future psychological possibilities, showing potential developments in spiritual understanding or religious commitment that may unfold over time. Warning dreams alert individuals to spiritual dangers such as inflation, fanaticism, or loss of ethical grounding that may accompany intense religious experiences. Healing dreams provide direct therapeutic experiences through encounter with divine healers, sacred rituals, or transformative spiritual energies that promote psychological and sometimes physical recovery. Initiatory dreams prepare individuals for major spiritual transitions by providing symbolic death and rebirth experiences that facilitate psychological transformation. The interpretation of religious dreams requires what Jung called a synthetic rather than reductive approach. Rather than analyzing religious imagery as disguised expressions of personal conflicts, Jung emphasized understanding the prospective and purposive aspects of such dreams. Religious symbols in dreams often point towards psychological and spiritual potentials that the dreamer needs to develop, rather than representing past traumas or repressed desires. For example, a dream of climbing a sacred mountain might indicate the need for spiritual aspiration and transcendent perspective, rather than symbolizing sexual wishes or power drives. This synthetic approach requires familiarity with religious symbolism from various traditions, while maintaining focus on the dream's relevance to the individual dreamer's life situation and developmental needs. Jung emphasized that religious dreams should not be interpreted as literal divine communications, but rather as expressions of the psyche's natural wisdom about spiritual development and psychological healing. Active imagination represents Jung's most important contribution to working with religious imagery that emerges from the unconscious. This technique involves conscious engagement with dream images, fantasies, and archetypal figures through various means including visualization, dialogue, artistic expression, and dramatic enactment. When individuals encounter religious figures in dreams, Jung encouraged them to continue the relationship through active imagination, asking questions, receiving guidance, and developing ongoing dialogue with these inner spiritual teachers. This practice allows deeper exploration of the psychological and spiritual meanings contained within religious imagery, while maintaining conscious discrimination and ethical responsibility. Active imagination with religious content often produces profound insights about personal meaning, life direction, and spiritual development that might not emerge through purely intellectual study of religious traditions. However, Jung warned against literal identification with religious figures encountered in dreams or active imagination, emphasizing the importance of maintaining ego boundaries while receiving the wisdom these figures represent. The therapeutic implications of working with religious dreams proved central to Jung's analytical approach. He observed that many psychological symptoms reflected disconnection from the natural religious function of the psyche, leading to spiritual emptiness and loss of meaning. Dreams containing religious imagery often signal the beginning of psychological healing by reconnecting individuals with sources of meaning and guidance that transcend personal concerns. Therapeutic work with such dreams involves helping patients understand the psychological and spiritual messages being communicated while supporting their capacity to integrate these insights into conscious life. This process often requires considerable time and patience, as religious dream imagery may be initially threatening or overwhelming to individuals who have rejected spiritual concerns or experienced religious trauma. Jung developed specific techniques for helping patients approach religious content in dreams with appropriate respect and discrimination, avoiding both dismissive skepticism and uncritical acceptance that might lead to inflation or spiritual bypassing. Contemporary research in psychology and neuroscience has provided new understanding of the mechanisms underlying religious dream experiences while confirming many of Jung's observations about their psychological significance. Studies of brain activity during dreaming reveal that religious and mystical experiences often involve activation of specific neural networks associated with meaning-making, self-transcendence, and emotional regulation. Research on trauma recovery has documented the healing potential of religious and spiritual imagery that emerges spontaneously in dreams and guided visualization. Cross-cultural studies continue to confirm the universal appearance of similar religious symbols in dreams across different societies and religious traditions. These findings support Jung's contention that religious dream imagery emerges from deep psychological structures that serve important functions in mental health and spiritual development. Contemporary therapeutic approaches increasingly incorporate methods for working with religious and spiritual content in dreams, recognizing the profound healing potential of these naturally occurring psychological phenomena. Part 8. The Shadow and Religious Projection. Jung's concept of the shadow revolutionized understanding of how religious communities often become vehicles for collective projection of disowned psychological contents rather than genuine spiritual development. The shadow consists of all aspects of personality that individuals and groups reject, repress, or fail to acknowledge in themselves, creating a reservoir of unconscious material that inevitably seeks expression through projection onto others. In religious contexts, shadow projection manifests as demonization of other faith traditions, scapegoating of individuals who violate community norms, and identification of evil with external enemies rather than recognizing the potential for darkness within oneself and one's community. Understanding shadow dynamics helps explain why religious institutions, despite their stated commitment to love and spiritual development, often become sources of conflict, prejudice, and persecution. The personal shadow develops through socialization processes that require individuals to suppress certain aspects of their natural temperament to gain acceptance from family and community. Religious education often intensifies shadow formation by teaching strict moral codes that condemn natural human tendencies such as anger, sexuality, pride, and competitive striving. Children learn to identify with idealized religious images while projecting unacceptable impulses onto designated categories of sinners, heretics, or evil persons. This splitting process creates what Jung called a false religious personality that appears virtuous and spiritual while remaining unconscious of its own capacity for the very behaviors it condemns in others. The stronger the conscious religious identity, the larger and more powerful the compensating shadow often becomes, creating potential for dramatic moral failures and spiritual crises when unconscious contents finally demand recognition. Religious traditions worldwide recognize this dynamic through teachings about spiritual pride, the danger of judging others, and the need for ongoing self-examination and confession of personal shortcomings. Collective shadow projection operates on a larger scale, when entire religious communities identify their tradition with divine will while viewing other traditions as misguided, evil, or inspired by demonic forces. This dynamic has fueled countless religious wars, persecution of minorities, and systematic oppression of groups designated as spiritual enemies. Jung observed that the stronger a community's conscious identification with goodness and truth, the more likely it becomes to project its collective shadow onto religious others. Fundamentalist movements of all traditions demonstrate this pattern by claiming exclusive access to divine truth while demonizing alternative approaches to spirituality and meaning. The psychological function of such projection is to maintain group cohesion and individual self-esteem by locating all evil outside the community boundaries. However, this defensive strategy prevents genuine spiritual development by blocking the self-knowledge and humility that authentic religious growth requires. Religious institutions often become structured around shadow projection through doctrines that emphasize human sinfulness while projecting divine perfection onto transcendent realms. While recognition of human limitation and moral fallibility can support spiritual humility and growth, excessive emphasis on sinfulness may create what Jung called negative inflation, where individuals identify completely with their inadequacy and project all positive qualities onto external divine figures. This dynamic prevents development of healthy self-worth and personal responsibility while fostering dependent relationships with religious authorities who claim special access to divine grace. Conversely, religious leaders may develop positive inflation by identifying with the divine projections of their followers, leading to spiritual pride, abuse of power, and eventual moral failure when shadow contents break through conscious defenses. Healthy religious development requires gradually withdrawing projections from both positive and negative directions, learning to recognize divine potential within oneself while acknowledging personal limitations and capacity for moral failure. This process of projection withdrawal is often facilitated by spiritual practices that cultivate direct relationship with sacred reality rather than mediated access through institutional authorities. The integration of religious shadow material requires what Jung called shadow work, the conscious acknowledgement and integration of rejected aspects of personality and community identity. For individuals, this involves recognizing their own capacity for the behaviors they criticize in others, owning projections onto religious enemies, and developing compassion for universal human struggles with moral and spiritual challenges. Shadow work often begins with examining strong emotional reactions to other people's religious beliefs or practices, as such reactions frequently indicate projection of disowned psychological contents. A person who feels intense anger toward religious conservatives might discover their own need for structure and moral certainty, while someone who despises liberal theology might recognize their own doubts about traditional beliefs. This process requires considerable courage and humility, as it involves dismantling idealized self-images and acknowledging uncomfortable truths about personal motivations and limitations. However, successful shadow integration leads to greater authenticity, reduced judgment of others, and increased capacity for genuine spiritual development rather than defensive religious posturing. Religious communities can engage in collective shadow work through various means, including honest examination of their historical behavior, acknowledgement of harm done to other groups, and recognition of truth and value in alternative spiritual approaches. Interfaith dialogue provides opportunities for communities to discover projected contents by encountering the humanity and spiritual depth of traditions they previously dismissed or demonized. Such encounters often reveal that other traditions possess insights and practices that one's own community has neglected or rejected, leading to enrichment rather than threat to authentic spiritual identity. Progressive religious movements often emphasize social justice work as a form of collective shadow integration, recognizing their community's complicity in systems of oppression and working to repair historical damages. However, shadow work must avoid becoming another form of inflation, where communities pride themselves on their superior consciousness while projecting shadow contents onto less progressive religious groups. Genuine collective shadow integration requires ongoing humility about the universal human tendency toward projection and the recognition that every religious tradition contains both light and darkness, wisdom and ignorance, compassion and cruelty. The relationship between shadow work and authentic mystical experience represents a crucial dimension of religious development that Jung observed in his study of contemplative traditions. Genuine mystical states often involve temporary dissolution of ego boundaries that allows direct encounter with both divine radiance and personal darkness simultaneously. Mystics throughout history have reported that authentic spiritual awakening includes recognition of their own capacity for evil alongside experience of divine love and union. This paradoxical awareness prevents spiritual inflation while deepening compassion for all beings who struggle with the complexities of moral and spiritual development. Religious traditions that emphasize only divine love and transcendence while avoiding shadow integration often produce spiritually immature practitioners who remain vulnerable to projection and moral failure. Conversely, traditions that include systematic shadow work through practices such as confession, self-examination, and contemplation of death and impermanence tend to produce more psychologically integrated and spiritually mature practitioners who can embody genuine wisdom and compassion rather than defensive spiritual personas. Part 9. The Anima, Animus and Sacred Marriage. Jung's discovery of the Anima and Animus archetypes revealed fundamental aspects of human psychology that find profound expression in religious symbolism worldwide, particularly through imagery of sacred marriage, divine union, and the integration of masculine and feminine spiritual principles. The anima represents the unconscious feminine aspect in men, while the animus represents the unconscious masculine aspect in women, both serving as bridges between consciousness and the deeper layers of the psyche. These archetypal figures frequently appear in religious traditions as divine couples, sacred marriages, and mystical unions that symbolize the psychological integration necessary for spiritual wholeness. Understanding anima and animus dynamics helps explain both the psychological appeal of religious imagery involving gender complementarity and the spiritual significance of integrating contrasexual aspects of personality. The anima in men typically manifests through attraction to feminine figures who embody qualities that patriarchal conditioning has discouraged in masculine development. These might include emotional sensitivity, intuitive wisdom, receptive awareness, nurturing care, and connection with natural cycles and processes. When the anima remains unconscious, men often project these qualities onto women in their lives, creating relationships characterized by idealization, dependency, and eventual disillusionment when actual women fail to fulfill archetypal projections. In religious contexts, anima projection manifests through devotion to feminine divine figures such as the Virgin Mary, Kuan Yin, Sophia, or various goddess forms that represent idealized feminine qualities. While such devotional practices can facilitate spiritual development by connecting men with neglected psychological potentials, they may also prevent direct development of feminine qualities within men's own personalities. Jung observed that spiritual maturation requires gradually withdrawing anima projections from external figures, and developing conscious relationship with feminine psychological functions as internal resources for creativity, emotional wisdom, and spiritual receptivity. The animus in women often appears through attraction to masculine figures who embody qualities that traditional feminine conditioning has discouraged or prohibited. These typically include rational discrimination, assertive action, goal-oriented achievement, intellectual authority, and spiritual leadership capacity. Unconscious animus projection may create relationships where women depend on men to provide direction, meaning, and spiritual authority rather than developing these capacities within themselves. Religious traditions have often institutionalized animus projection by restricting women's access to positions of spiritual authority, while encouraging devotional relationships with masculine divine figures or male religious leaders. Such arrangements may provide psychological stability, but often prevent women from discovering their own capacity for spiritual leadership, theological insight, and direct relationship with divine reality. Contemporary women's spirituality movements frequently focus on reclaiming feminine divine imagery and developing women's spiritual authority as means of withdrawing animus projections and integrating masculine psychological functions in service of authentic spiritual development. Sacred marriage symbolism appears in religious traditions worldwide as a representation of the psychological integration that Jung called the mysterium conjunctionis, the mysterious conjunction of opposites that produces psychological wholeness. Hindu Tantra, Christian mystical marriage, Jewish Shekinah and divine masculine union, and countless mythological tales of divine couples all point toward the archetypal pattern of sacred marriage as spiritual realization. These symbols recognize that spiritual development requires integration of both masculine and feminine psychological principles rather than identification with only one gender's traditional qualities. The sacred marriage represents neither literal sexual union nor romantic relationship, but rather the internal psychological process by which individuals develop access to the full range of human psychological capacities, regardless of their biological gender. This integration enables what Jung called psychological androgyny, the capacity to access both masculine and feminine functions as appropriate to different situations and developmental challenges. Religious practices that cultivate this integration often involve meditation on divine couples, visualization of internal masculine and feminine aspects, or ritual enactment of sacred marriage themes that facilitate psychological union of contrasexual elements. The development of Anima and Animus integration follows predictable patterns that Jung observed across cultures and historical periods. Initial projection stages involve unconscious attraction to external figures who embody contrasexual qualities, leading to romantic relationships, spiritual devotions, or mentor relationships that serve developmental functions while maintaining projection. Disillusionment phases occur when external figures fail to fulfill archetypal expectations, creating opportunities for recognizing projection and beginning internal development of contrasexual qualities. Integration phases involve conscious cultivation of previously rejected psychological functions through spiritual practices, therapeutic work, creative expression, or life experiences that require development of contrasexual capacities. Advanced integration produces individuals who can access both masculine and feminine psychological functions fluidly, while maintaining conscious relationship with anima or animus figures as internal sources of wisdom and guidance. Religious traditions often recognize these developmental stages through different levels of spiritual practice, from devotional approaches appropriate for beginning practitioners to advanced contemplative methods that emphasize internal integration and direct spiritual realization. Jung's analysis of religious mysticism revealed that authentic spiritual experience often involves temporary dissolution of gender identification and access to psychological wholeness that transcends masculine and feminine categories. Mystics throughout history have reported states of consciousness in which ordinary gender identity dissolves into universal awareness that includes both masculine and feminine qualities simultaneously. These experiences provide direct access to the psychological integration that sacred marriage symbolism represents, confirming through lived experience the spiritual significance of contra-sexual development. However, Jung warned against premature or forced attempts to transcend gender identity without first developing healthy relationship with both masculine and feminine psychological functions. Genuine transcendence emerges from integration rather than rejection of gender-associated qualities, requiring careful development of contrasexual capacities before their synthesis in mystical awareness becomes possible. Religious traditions that emphasize gender transcendence without supporting the developmental work of Anima and Animus integration often produce practitioners who remain unconsciously identified with one-sided gender roles while claiming spiritual superiority to ordinary human psychological development. Contemporary implications of Jung's Anima and Animus psychology include both individual therapeutic applications and broader cultural transformations in religious understanding. Therapeutic work with Anima and Animus often helps individuals understand relationship patterns, career dissatisfactions and spiritual longings as expressions of contrasexual development needs rather than external problems requiring environmental solutions. Couples therapy increasingly incorporates understanding of Anima and Animus projection as a source of both attraction and conflict in intimate relationships, helping partners withdraw projections and develop internal psychological resources. Religious communities are reconsidering traditional gender roles and spiritual authority structures in light of psychological research supporting the importance of gender integration for spiritual development. Contemporary spirituality movements often emphasize practices that cultivate both masculine and feminine qualities in all practitioners, regardless of biological gender. Recognizing that spiritual wholeness requires integration of the full range of human psychological capacities, these developments reflect growing recognition that authentic spiritual development serves psychological individuation, while psychological integration facilitates genuine spiritual realization in the synthesis that Jung called the sacred marriage of consciousness and unconscious, masculine and feminine, human and divine. Part 10. The Self-Archetype as Inner God Image. The self-archetype represents Jung's most profound contribution to understanding the psychological basis of religious experience, serving as the organizing principle of the psyche that manifests through images of divine wholeness, cosmic consciousness, and ultimate spiritual realization. Jung discovered that the self operates as both the source and goal of psychological development, providing the energy that motivates individuation while also representing its ultimate achievement in psychological wholeness and spiritual integration. The self frequently appears in religious traditions through symbols of divine unity such as mandalas, sacred mountains, world trees, divine light, and various representations of cosmic consciousness or God realization. Understanding the self as an archetypal pattern helps explain both the psychological appeal of religious imagery involving divine union and the therapeutic potential of spiritual practices that facilitate self-encounter. The self-archetype differs fundamentally from the ego, which represents only the conscious aspect of personality organized around everyday identity and social adaptation, while the ego develops through learning, cultural conditioning, and adaptation to external demands, the self exists as an innate potential for wholeness that guides psychological development from birth to death. The self includes both conscious and unconscious elements representing the totality of what an individual might become rather than just current conscious achievements. Jung observed that healthy ego development requires maintaining conscious relationship with the self as a source of guidance and meaning that transcends personal concerns and social expectations. When individuals lose connection with the self, they often experience depression, anxiety, meaninglessness, and various forms of psychological fragmentation that reflect the absence of a unifying center for personality organization. Conversely, when self-connection is maintained or restored, individuals typically experience enhanced creativity, resilience, sense of purpose, and capacity for contributing to collective welfare rather than merely pursuing personal advantage. Religious traditions worldwide recognize the self-archetype through various symbols and practices designed to facilitate encounter with divine wholeness and cosmic consciousness. Mandala symbols appear across cultures as representations of psychological and spiritual integration, depicting the union of opposites around a central organizing principle. Sacred mountains in traditions from Mount Sinai to Mount Kailash represent the axis mundi, the cosmic center where human consciousness connects with divine reality. World tree imagery from the Norse Yggdrasil to the Buddhist Bodhi tree symbolizes the self as the organizing principle that connects earthly existence with transcendent reality. Divine light symbols from the Christian resurrection to Hindu descriptions of cosmic consciousness represent the self's luminous quality that illuminates both personal psychology and universal truth. These symbols emerge spontaneously in the dreams and meditation experiences of contemporary individuals seeking spiritual meaning, confirming their archetypal rather than merely cultural origins. The relationship between ego and self represents one of the most crucial dynamics in both psychological development and spiritual realization. Healthy development requires maintaining appropriate distance between ego and self, avoiding both unconscious identification and defensive separation. Ego inflation occurs when individuals identify consciously with self-archetypal contents, leading to grandiose delusions of divine status, messianic complexes, or spiritual superiority over ordinary human concerns. Such inflation often manifests in religious contexts through claims of special spiritual status, direct divine revelation, or authority over others' spiritual development. Conversely, ego deflation occurs when individuals feel completely separated from self-connection, leading to depression, meaninglessness, and various forms of psychological fragmentation. Optimal psychological health requires what Jung called conscious relationship with the self, where the ego maintains its functioning capacity while receiving guidance and meaning from the deeper organizing principle without identifying with it completely. Jung's clinical work revealed that self-encounters often occur through numinous experiences that provide direct access to the transpersonal dimension of the psyche. These might manifest as mystical states, profound dreams, synchronistic events, or encounters with spiritual presences that transform the individual's understanding of reality and their place within it. Self-experiences typically carry intense emotional significance and often feel more real than ordinary consciousness, providing lasting changes in personality organization and life orientation. However, Jung emphasized that such experiences should be understood psychologically rather than metaphysically, representing contact with the deepest layers of the individual psyche rather than external divine entities. This psychological interpretation does not diminish the significance of self-encounters, but rather locates their transformative power within natural psychological processes that can be studied empirically and supported therapeutically. Religious practices such as meditation, prayer, contemplative reading and ritual participation often facilitate self-encounters by providing structured access to non-rational dimensions of awareness where archetypal contents become accessible to consciousness. The therapeutic implications of working with self-archetypal material proved central to Jung's analytical psychology and continue to influence contemporary approaches to spirituality and mental health. Jung observed that many psychological symptoms reflect disconnection from self-guidance, leading to loss of meaning, direction, and sense of personal significance within larger patterns of purpose. Therapeutic work often involves helping individuals recognize and respond to self-communications through dreams, active imagination, creative expression, and attention to synchronistic events that provide guidance for life decisions and developmental challenges. This process requires considerable skill and ethical responsibility, as premature or inappropriate self-identification can lead to inflation and psychological instability. Effective therapeutic work with self-material involves supporting ego development while facilitating access to transpersonal resources that promote healing and integration without overwhelming conscious capacity. Contemporary research in psychology and neuroscience increasingly supports the therapeutic value of spiritual practices and self-oriented approaches to mental health, recognizing that purely secular therapeutic methods may be insufficient for addressing existential concerns and meaning-related psychological problems. Jung's understanding of the self as God image within the psyche created possibilities for dialogue between psychology and religious traditions while maintaining scientific objectivity about metaphysical claims. He argued that psychology cannot determine whether God exists as external reality, but can study the psychological effects of God images that appear universally in human experience. The self-archetype provides a natural psychological basis for religious experience without requiring belief in supernatural entities, while also not denying the possibility that archetypal experiences might reflect contact with transcendent reality. This approach allows psychologists to work respectfully with religious material while maintaining scientific methodology, and enables religious practitioners to understand their experiences psychologically without reducing them to mere psychological phenomena. Contemporary approaches to spirituality and psychology increasingly integrate Jungian insights about the self with various religious and contemplative traditions, recognizing that psychological understanding can enhance rather than threaten authentic spiritual development. The self-archetype continues to provide a valuable framework for understanding both the universal human need for meaning and transcendence, and the particular ways this need manifests through individual psychological development and spiritual seeking. Part 11. Jung's analysis of Christianity and the need for transformation. Jung's relationship with Christianity was complex and evolving, shaped by his upbringing as the son of a Swiss Reformed pastor and his lifelong struggle to understand the psychological significance of Christian symbols and doctrines. While maintaining respect for Christianity's spiritual insights, Jung became increasingly critical of institutional Christianity's failure to address modern psychological needs and its resistance to evolutionary development. His analysis of Christian symbolism revealed both profound wisdom about human psychological development and dangerous one-sidedness that created collective neuroses requiring therapeutic intervention. Jung's critique focused not on Christianity's spiritual core, but on its historical tendency to suppress shadow material, reject feminine divine imagery, and resist integration with advancing human consciousness about psychological development and scientific understanding. Jung observed that Christian symbolism contains remarkable insights about the individuation process, particularly through the figure of Christ as a representation of the self-archetype and the model for psychological wholeness. The birth, life, death, and resurrection of Christ provide a complete mythological framework for understanding the process by which ego consciousness must die to its limited identification and be reborn in relationship with transpersonal meaning. The Trinity doctrine represents an advanced understanding of psychological differentiation, showing how divine unity manifests through multiple aspects that remain unified while expressing different functions. Christian mystical traditions developed sophisticated practices for facilitating direct encounter with divine reality that parallel Jung's understanding of self-realization through withdrawal of projections and internal spiritual development. However, Jung argued that institutional Christianity often presents these profound psychological insights as historical facts requiring literal belief rather than symbolic frameworks for understanding ongoing psychological and spiritual development. This literalization prevents individuals from accessing the transformative potential of Christian symbolism while creating unnecessary conflicts between religious faith and scientific understanding. The shadow problem in Christianity particularly concerned Jung, as he observed that Christian emphasis on divine goodness and human sinfulness created massive projection of evil onto external enemies rather than recognition of darkness within Christian individuals and communities. The identification of Christ with pure goodness while projecting evil onto Satan, Jews, heretics, and various designated enemies prevented Christians from developing the shadow integration necessary for genuine spiritual maturation. Jung documented how Christian communities throughout history had committed atrocities while maintaining their identification with divine goodness, suggesting massive unconsciousness about their own capacity for evil. He argued that authentic Christian development requires acknowledging the shadow of Christian history, integrating awareness of evil potential within Christian communities, and developing genuine humility about human moral limitations. This shadow work would not diminish Christianity's spiritual significance, but rather enable it to fulfill its potential for promoting authentic rather than defensive spiritual development. Jung's controversial work Answer to Job explored these themes by analyzing the biblical text as a psychological document revealing God's own need for consciousness development through relationship with human awareness and moral sensibility. The feminine principle in Christianity represented another area where Jung identified crucial psychological imbalances requiring corrective development. While Christianity includes important feminine figures such as the Virgin Mary and various female saints, the tradition's overwhelming emphasis on masculine divine imagery creates psychological problems for both men and women seeking spiritual development. Men may develop excessive identification with masculine spiritual ideals while remaining unconscious of their need for feminine psychological qualities such as receptivity, emotional sensitivity, and connection with natural processes. Women may internalize the subordination of feminine qualities within Christian theology, leading to difficulties developing authentic spiritual authority and direct relationship with divine reality. Jung argued that Christianity's future development requires greater integration of feminine divine imagery and recognition of the sacred feminine as equal to masculine spiritual principles. He saw the Catholic doctrine of the Assumption of Mary as a positive development, indicating Christianity's unconscious recognition of its need for feminine divine imagery. though he argued that much more development was needed to achieve genuine psychological balance in Christian understanding of divine reality. Jung's critique of modern Christianity focused particularly on its failure to engage seriously with psychological insights about human development and spiritual formation. He observed that many Christian institutions continued to operate according to pre-psychological understandings of human nature, ignoring discoveries about unconscious processes, developmental psychology, and the complexity of human motivation. This psychological naivety led to pastoral approaches that often increased rather than decreased psychological suffering by promoting unrealistic expectations, suppressing natural human impulses, and failing to address the actual psychological needs of contemporary individuals. Jung argued that Christianity could benefit enormously from integration with psychological understanding, using therapeutic insights to enhance rather than replace traditional spiritual practices. Such integration would involve training religious leaders in psychological sophistication, developing spiritual practices informed by knowledge of unconscious processes, and creating communities that support genuine psychological development rather than conformity to external religious expectations. This evolution would not require abandoning Christian tradition, but rather fulfilling its potential by incorporating advances in understanding of human psychological and spiritual development. The relationship between individual religious experience and collective Christian institutions concerned Jung throughout his later years. He observed that institutional Christianity often suppressed the very spiritual experiences that gave rise to the tradition in favor of standardized beliefs and practices that could be controlled by religious authorities. This institutional pressure toward conformity prevented many Christians from developing authentic personal relationships with divine reality, creating dependence on external religious authorities rather than internal spiritual guidance. Jung argued that healthy Christianity required balance between collective wisdom preserved in tradition and individual spiritual development that might lead beyond conventional religious understanding. He suggested that Christianity's future depended on its capacity to support, rather than suppress, individual spiritual development, while maintaining connection with the collective wisdom accumulated through centuries of Christian experience. This balance would require institutional changes that honored both traditional insights and contemporary spiritual needs, creating space for spiritual innovation while preserving essential Christian insights about human development and divine reality. Jung's vision of Christianity's potential transformation involved what he called the development of a new religious attitude appropriate to modern consciousness while remaining rooted in essential Christian insights. This evolution would involve greater psychological sophistication, integration of scientific understanding with spiritual insight, recognition of religious wisdom in other traditions, and development of practices supporting genuine individual spiritual development. Such transformed Christianity would be more rather than less spiritual than conventional forms, but would express its spirituality through psychological maturity, ethical sophistication, and genuine compassion rather than defensive adherence to literal interpretations of ancient texts. Jung believed that Christianity contained the essential insights necessary for such transformation, but required courage to evolve beyond historical limitations toward fuller expression of its spiritual potential. Contemporary developments in progressive Christianity often reflect themes Jung identified, including greater emphasis on mystical experience, integration with psychological understanding, social justice commitment, and interfaith dialogue. However, Jung's challenge to Christianity remains largely unfulfilled, as many Christian institutions continue to resist the psychological and spiritual evolution he considered necessary for Christianity's continued relevance and effectiveness in supporting human development and social healing. Part 12. Eastern Religions and Jung's Cross-Cultural Insights. Jung's encounter with Eastern religious traditions profoundly influenced his understanding of the universal nature of spiritual development, while also revealing important differences between Eastern and Western approaches to consciousness and individuation. Through his study of Hindu philosophy, Buddhist psychology, Taoist wisdom, and various forms of Asian meditation and yoga, Jung discovered remarkable parallels to his own psychological insights about archetypal patterns, consciousness development, and the process of individuation. However, he also identified significant differences between Eastern and Western psychological constitutions that required careful consideration when applying Eastern practices to Western individuals. Jung's cross-cultural analysis helped establish the universality of the religious function while also emphasizing the importance of culturally appropriate approaches to spiritual development that honor both universal archetypal patterns and particular psychological constitutions shaped by different cultural histories. Jung's introduction to Eastern philosophy came primarily through his collaboration with sinologist Richard Wilhelm, who provided German translations of classical Chinese texts, including the I Ching and The Secret of the Golden Flower. Through Wilhelm's scholarship, Jung encountered sophisticated psychological systems that had developed independently of Western thought, yet described remarkably similar processes of consciousness development and integration. The Taoist understanding of the union of opposites through the dynamic relationship between yin and yang paralleled Jung's insights about the integration of conscious and unconscious contents through the transcendent function. Chinese descriptions of the development of the golden flower or diamond body corresponded to Jung's understanding of self-realization through the individuation process. Buddhist psychology's analysis of the ego as illusion and the path toward enlightenment through recognition of interdependence reflected Jung's insights about the limitations of ego consciousness and the need for relationship with transpersonal dimensions of the psyche. These parallels convinced Jung that his psychological discoveries reflected universal patterns of human development rather than culturally specific Western phenomena. However, Jung also recognized crucial differences between Eastern and Western approaches to spiritual development that reflected different cultural histories and psychological constitutions. Eastern traditions generally began with the assumption that ego consciousness was illusion requiring dissolution, while Western psychology emphasized the importance of first developing strong ego functioning before transcending its limitations. Asian cultures had developed sophisticated practices for quieting mental activity and accessing transpersonal awareness, but often lacked emphasis on individual personality development and psychological differentiation that Western culture had achieved through its historical emphasis on individualism. Jung argued that Westerners who attempted to bypass ego development through Eastern practices often encountered psychological problems because they had not first established the psychological foundation necessary for safe transcendence of ordinary consciousness. Conversely, Eastern practitioners sometimes benefited from Western psychological insights about personal development, emotional processing, and the importance of integrating rather than simply transcending psychological contents. Jung's cross-cultural analysis suggested that optimal spiritual development might require synthesis of Eastern wisdom about transpersonal realization with Western insights about psychological individuation and personality integration. Jung's study of Hindu philosophy revealed sophisticated understanding of consciousness development that complemented and extended his own psychological insights. The Hindu concept of the self as Atman, the divine essence within each individual, paralleled Jung's understanding of the self-archetype as the organizing principle of the psyche and the goal of individuation. The 4 stages of life described in Hindu tradition corresponded to Jung's observations about psychological development from youth through old age, with each stage requiring different spiritual practices and psychological focuses. Hindu descriptions of various types of yoga provided systematic approaches to psychological and spiritual development that addressed different temperaments and constitutional types. The concept of Maya or illusion offered insights into how consciousness creates false identifications that prevent recognition of deeper spiritual reality. However, Jung also observed that Hindu emphasis on transcending the world of appearances sometimes led to rejection of psychological development and interpersonal relationship that he considered essential for complete individuation in Western cultural contexts. Buddhist psychology provided Jung with detailed maps of consciousness development that illuminated aspects of the therapeutic process he had observed in his clinical work. The 4 Noble Truths described the psychological mechanics of suffering and liberation that paralleled Jung's understanding of how unconscious identification creates neurosis, while conscious relationship with archetypal contents promotes healing. The Eightfold Path provided systematic practices for developing the ethical foundation, mental concentration, and wisdom necessary for psychological transformation. Buddhist analysis of the skandhas or components of personal identity offered sophisticated understanding of how ego consciousness constructs itself through selective attention and conceptual overlay. Meditation practices developed in Buddhist tradition provided direct methods for observing unconscious mental processes and developing the capacity for conscious relationship with psychological contents without identification or repression. Jung found these insights valuable for his therapeutic work, while also noting that Buddhist emphasis on detachment sometimes conflicted with Western psychological needs for passionate engagement with life and personal relationship. The I Ching, or Book of Changes, provided Jung with a practical method for accessing unconscious wisdom that complemented his work with dreams and active imagination. Jung used the I Ching extensively in his personal life and occasionally in therapeutic work, finding that the oracle provided access to unconscious perspectives on current life situations that often proved remarkably relevant and helpful. His introduction to the German translation emphasized that the I Ching operated according to synchronistic rather than causal principles, providing meaningful connections between inner psychological states and external symbolic guidance. This practice helped Jung develop his understanding of synchronicity as a valid form of knowledge acquisition that complemented rational analysis while accessing different types of information about psychological and spiritual development. However, Jung also warned against excessive dependence on oracular guidance, emphasizing that such practices should support rather than replace individual psychological development and ethical responsibility. Contemporary interest in Eastern divination practices often reflects the Western need for access to non-rational sources of guidance, though Jung's emphasis on psychological sophistication remains relevant for avoiding superstitious or regressive uses of such methods. Jung's encounter with Eastern meditation practices led to important insights about the relationship between spiritual techniques and psychological development. He observed that meditation could provide valuable methods for developing concentration, emotional regulation, and access to deeper levels of consciousness that supported the individuation process. However, he also noted that Westerners often used meditation to avoid rather than engage with psychological material that required conscious integration, leading to spiritual bypassing rather than genuine development. Jung argued that effective meditation practice for Westerners often required combination with psychological work that addressed personal history, relationship patterns, and emotional development before transcendent practices could be pursued safely. His insights anticipated contemporary discussions about the integration of Eastern spiritual practices with Western psychotherapy, recognizing both the value and limitations of cross-cultural spiritual borrowing. Jung's approach suggested that authentic spiritual development required understanding both universal archetypal patterns and particular cultural and individual constitutions that shaped how these patterns could be most effectively accessed and integrated in specific contexts and communities. Part 13. Alchemy as Psychological and Spiritual Transformation. Jung's discovery of alchemy as a historical parallel to his analytical psychology provided crucial validation for his theories about individuation and revealed sophisticated understanding of psychological transformation that had been hidden in obscure symbolic language for centuries. Through years of studying alchemical texts, Jung realized that medieval and Renaissance alchemists were not merely primitive chemists attempting to create gold from base metals, but rather sophisticated psychologists who had developed systematic approaches to consciousness transformation using chemical metaphors. The alchemical opus, or great work, represented a complete map of the individuation process, describing the stages of psychological development through which consciousness could be refined from its initial unconscious state to the achievement of psychological wholeness, symbolized by the philosopher's stone. Jung's interpretation of alchemy provided historical precedent for his psychological insights, while also offering detailed symbolic frameworks for understanding the complex processes involved in authentic spiritual and psychological transformation. The alchemical process typically began with what was called the prima materia, or first matter, representing the initial unconscious condition of the psyche before conscious development begins. This corresponds psychologically to the state of unconscious identification with instinctual patterns, cultural conditioning, and archetypal contents that characterizes early psychological development. The first major operation, called the nigredo or blackening, involved breaking down existing psychological structures through encounters with shadow material, personal limitations, and the dissolution of false identifications. This phase often feels like psychological death or descent into chaos, as familiar patterns of identity prove inadequate for life's challenges and deeper psychological contents demand recognition. Religious traditions recognize this stage through various metaphors, such as the dark night of the soul, descent into hell, or the purgatorial process that precedes spiritual transformation. Jung observed that many individuals seeking therapeutic help were actually in the nigredo phase of natural psychological development, requiring support for navigating the disorientation and apparent meaninglessness that characterizes this necessary stage of consciousness evolution. The albedo or whitening phase represents the emergence of new consciousness that results from successfully integrating shadow material and developing greater psychological differentiation. In this stage, individuals begin to distinguish between their authentic nature and false identifications imposed by family, culture, or unconscious archetypal possession. The albedo corresponds to what Jung called the development of psychological objectivity, the capacity to observe one's own psychological processes without complete identification, while also remaining engaged with life's practical demands. This phase often involves intensive work with anima and animus contents as individuals develop conscious relationship with contrasexual aspects of their personality that had previously remained unconscious or projected onto others. Alchemical imagery of purification, distillation and separation reflects the psychological work of distinguishing authentic personal potentials from unconscious identifications and external impositions. The albedo represents significant psychological achievement, but is not the final goal of alchemical transformation, as it may lead to excessive detachment or spiritual pride if not balanced by further development. The rubedo, or reddening, represents the final phase of alchemical work, involving the integration of all previous developments into a new synthesis that Jung called the realization of the self. In this stage, the psychological opposites that were separated during the albedo phase are reunited at a higher level of consciousness that transcends their previous conflict. The rubedo corresponds to what mystical traditions call divine union, enlightenment, or self-realization, where individual consciousness recognizes its essential unity with cosmic consciousness while maintaining its particular identity and capacity for compassionate action. Alchemical symbols for this achievement include the philosopher's stone, the red king, the chemical wedding, and various images of perfected matter that cannot be corrupted or destroyed by external circumstances. Jung emphasized that the rubedo represents psychological achievement rather than permanent state, requiring ongoing attention and development to maintain the integration of conscious and unconscious contents in the dynamic process of continued individuation. Contemporary individuals may experience temporary rubedo states through mystical experiences, creative breakthroughs, or profound therapeutic insights, though stabilizing such realization in ongoing psychological and spiritual development requires considerable time and dedication. Jung's analysis of alchemical symbolism revealed sophisticated understanding of the relationship between psychological development and spiritual realization that anticipated many insights of contemporary transpersonal psychology. Alchemists recognized that authentic transformation required working with both gross and subtle aspects of human nature, addressing practical psychological issues while also cultivating relationship with transcendent dimensions of reality. The alchemical emphasis on laboratory work reflected understanding that spiritual development requires engagement with material reality rather than escape into otherworldly realms. Alchemical imagery of chemical reactions, heating and cooling processes, and various apparatus corresponded to specific psychological operations that facilitate consciousness development through conscious engagement with unconscious contents. The alchemical tradition also emphasized the importance of moral and ethical development as prerequisites for advanced spiritual work, recognizing that psychological transformation without ethical foundation often leads to inflation and misuse of increased psychological powers. Contemporary approaches to spiritual development can benefit from alchemical insights about the systematic, gradual nature of authentic transformation and the need for balancing transcendent realization with practical psychological development and ethical responsibility. The gender symbolism in alchemy provided Jung with important insights about the psychological significance of masculine and feminine principles in consciousness development. Alchemical texts frequently describe the union of king and queen, sun and moon, or sulfur and mercury as essential for producing the philosopher's stone. These symbols represent the integration of masculine and feminine psychological functions that Jung identified as crucial for achieving psychological wholeness. The alchemical marriage or chemical wedding depicted in various texts corresponds to what Jung called the mysterium conjunctionis, the mysterious conjunction of opposites that produces self-realization. However, alchemical gender symbolism operates on multiple levels simultaneously, referring to psychological, spiritual and cosmic principles rather than literal gender categories. Understanding these symbolic levels helps contemporary practitioners avoid reducing alchemical insights to simplistic gender stereotypes, while accessing their profound wisdom about the integration of complementary psychological principles that transcend conventional masculine and feminine categories. Jung's work with alchemy also revealed the importance of what alchemists called the opus contra naturam, the work against nature that requires conscious intervention in natural psychological processes to achieve transformation that would not occur automatically. While psychological development follows natural patterns to some extent, achieving genuine individuation requires deliberate effort to integrate unconscious contents, resolve psychological conflicts, and develop capacities that exceed ordinary ego functioning. Alchemical emphasis on laboratory work, systematic procedures and sustained attention over many years reflects understanding that spiritual development requires dedication, patience and skillful means, rather than passive waiting for spontaneous enlightenment. This insight remains relevant for contemporary spiritual practitioners who may expect immediate results from meditation, therapy, or other transformational practices without recognizing the long-term commitment required for genuine psychological and spiritual development. Jung's alchemical studies confirmed his observation that individuation represents a lifelong process of consciousness development that requires both surrender to natural psychological processes and active participation in their conscious integration. The alchemical tradition provides detailed maps and practical guidance for navigating this complex process while maintaining realistic expectations about the time and effort required for achieving significant psychological transformation and spiritual realization. Part 14. Active Imagination and Direct Religious Experience. Active imagination represents Jung's most significant practical contribution to facilitating direct encounter with archetypal contents and religious experience through systematic engagement with unconscious material. This technique involves conscious dialogue with images, figures, and symbols that emerge from the unconscious through dreams, fantasies, or spontaneous visualization, allowing individuals to develop ongoing relationships with archetypal contents rather than remaining passive recipients of unconscious communications. Active imagination provides a bridge between ordinary consciousness and the deeper layers of the psyche, where religious experience originates, offering a practical method for accessing spiritual guidance, wisdom, and transformation without dependence on external religious authorities or institutionalized spiritual practices. Jung developed this technique through his own intensive self-analysis following his break with Freud, documenting his encounters with various archetypal figures in what later became known as the Red Book, a record of his personal spiritual and psychological journey that provided the foundation for his subsequent theoretical developments. The practice of active imagination requires what Jung called a descent into the unconscious, a deliberate opening of consciousness to contents that normally remain below the threshold of awareness. This process begins with relaxing ordinary rational control and allowing images, fantasies, or memories to emerge spontaneously without censorship or immediate interpretation. When significant images or figures appear, the practitioner engages them in direct dialogue, asking questions, expressing concerns, and receiving responses that often carry surprising wisdom and insight. The key principle is treating these inner figures as autonomous beings with their own perspectives and knowledge, rather than as mere projections of conscious concerns or wishes. This approach allows access to unconscious wisdom that can provide guidance for life decisions, creative inspiration, and spiritual development that exceeds the capacity of ordinary rational thought. However, Jung emphasized that active imagination requires strong ego development and ethical grounding to prevent identification with archetypal contents or inflation from encounter with transpersonal material. Religious figures frequently appear in active imagination as sources of spiritual guidance and wisdom for individuals seeking deeper meaning and connection with transcendent reality. These might include traditional religious figures such as Christ, Buddha, or various saints and sages, or unfamiliar spiritual teachers who emerge spontaneously from the unconscious with particular messages or insights. Jung observed that such figures often provide guidance that transcends the individual's conscious religious knowledge or beliefs, suggesting access to archetypal wisdom about spiritual development that exists independently of personal religious education. Engaging these figures through active imagination can facilitate profound spiritual experiences, including healing, forgiveness, insight into life purpose, and direct encounter with divine love and wisdom. However, Jung warned against literal identification with such experiences or claiming external divine authority for insights received through active imagination, emphasizing that such experiences should be understood as natural psychological phenomena that provide access to the transpersonal dimension of the psyche. The goal is developing ongoing relationship with inner sources of spiritual guidance while maintaining critical discrimination and ethical responsibility in applying insights received through this process. The therapeutic applications of active imagination proved particularly valuable for individuals struggling with spiritual crises, loss of meaning, or disconnection from religious resources. Many people seeking psychological help report feeling spiritually empty despite previous religious involvement, suggesting that their spiritual needs are not being met by conventional religious practices or communities. Active imagination provides access to personalized spiritual guidance that addresses individual circumstances and developmental needs while connecting with universal archetypal patterns that transcend particular religious traditions. This approach allows individuals to develop authentic spiritual life without requiring adherence to specific doctrines or participation in religious communities that may not serve their psychological and spiritual development. Therapeutic work with active imagination often helps individuals distinguish between authentic spiritual experience and religious conditioning, facilitating development of mature spiritual life based on direct experience rather than external authority. Contemporary approaches to spiritually integrated therapy increasingly incorporate active imagination techniques, recognizing their effectiveness for addressing existential concerns and facilitating spiritual development in secular therapeutic contexts. Jung's practice of active imagination also revealed important insights about the relationship between individual spiritual experience and collective religious traditions. He observed that archetypal figures encountered through active imagination often provided perspectives that both confirmed and challenged conventional religious teachings, suggesting that authentic spiritual experience transcends while also connecting with traditional wisdom. Individual spiritual guidance received through active imagination might support participation in particular religious communities, while also pointing toward developments beyond conventional religious understanding. This dynamic suggests that healthy spirituality requires balance between individual spiritual experience and collective religious wisdom, with neither completely subordinated to the other. Active imagination can help individuals develop discriminating relationship with religious traditions, appreciating their wisdom while also maintaining access to direct spiritual experience that may lead beyond conventional religious boundaries. Contemporary spiritual practitioners often find active imagination valuable for developing authentic spiritual life that honors both traditional wisdom and individual spiritual needs, without requiring complete acceptance of traditional religious authorities or doctrines. The practice of active imagination requires specific conditions and safeguards to prevent psychological problems and ensure constructive engagement with archetypal contents. Jung emphasized that practitioners must maintain clear boundaries between ordinary consciousness and active imagination states, entering and exiting the practice deliberately rather than allowing unconscious contents to overwhelm normal functioning. Regular practice periods with defined beginnings and endings help establish appropriate relationship with unconscious material while preventing invasion of everyday consciousness by archetypal contents. Written records of active imagination sessions provide opportunities for reflection and integration while also maintaining objectivity about the experiences and their practical applications. Sharing experiences with qualified guides or therapists can help prevent inflation or misinterpretation of archetypal encounters, while supporting integration of insights into conscious life. Jung also emphasized that active imagination should complement rather than replace engagement with external reality, practical responsibilities, and interpersonal relationships that provide grounding for psychological and spiritual development. Contemporary applications of active imagination extend beyond individual therapeutic practice to include artistic expression, creative inspiration, and various forms of spiritual practice that facilitate direct encounter with archetypal contents. Visual artists, writers, musicians, and other creative practitioners often report that their most significant work emerges through processes similar to active imagination, involving conscious engagement with unconscious sources of inspiration and wisdom. Spiritual direction and contemplative practices in various religious traditions incorporate elements of active imagination through guided meditation, visualization practices, and structured engagement with sacred imagery or texts. Contemporary spirituality movements often emphasize practices that facilitate direct spiritual experience rather than reliance on external religious authorities, reflecting Jung's insight that authentic spiritual development requires individual encounter with archetypal contents through methods such as active imagination. However, Jung's warnings about the need for psychological maturity and ethical grounding remain relevant for contemporary practitioners who may approach active imagination or similar practices without adequate preparation or support. Effective use of active imagination for spiritual development requires balance between openness to unconscious wisdom and maintenance of critical discrimination that prevents inflation, projection, or misuse of insights received through engagement with archetypal contents. Part 15. Jung's critique of modern Western spirituality. Jung's analysis of modern Western spirituality revealed fundamental problems in how contemporary individuals approach religious and spiritual development, often leading to superficial spiritual experiences that fail to address deeper psychological needs and may actually prevent authentic spiritual growth. He observed that Western spiritual seeking frequently reflects what he called the puer aeternus or eternal child complex, characterized by fascination with transcendent experiences while avoiding the psychological work necessary for genuine spiritual maturation. This pattern manifests through collecting spiritual experiences, pursuing exotic practices from foreign traditions, and seeking immediate enlightenment while bypassing the difficult work of shadow integration, emotional development, and ethical growth that authentic spirituality requires. Jung's critique anticipated many problems visible in contemporary New Age spirituality. Alternative religious movements, and even progressive forms of traditional religion that emphasize spiritual highs while neglecting psychological depth and moral development. The inflation problem in modern spirituality particularly concerned Jung, as he observed that spiritual experiences often led to grandiose self-concepts rather than genuine humility and service to others. Individuals who encounter archetypal content through meditation, psychedelic experiences, or various spiritual practices may identify with the transpersonal energies they access, leading to claims of special spiritual status or authority over others' spiritual development. This inflation prevents the integration of spiritual insights into ordinary human life, while creating spiritual personas that mask continued unconsciousness about personal limitations and psychological needs. Jung emphasized that authentic spiritual experience should lead to greater rather than lesser engagement with human psychological development, increased capacity for relationship and service, and deeper recognition of the ongoing need for conscious development, rather than claims of having achieved permanent spiritual attainment. Contemporary spiritual communities often struggle with these inflation dynamics, as charismatic leaders and devoted followers may collude in maintaining unrealistic spiritual ideals that prevent honest examination of human psychological complexity and moral ambiguity. Jung's insights about inflation remain highly relevant for evaluating the authenticity and psychological healthiness of various contemporary spiritual movements and practices. Spiritual bypassing represents another major problem in contemporary spirituality that Jung anticipated through his understanding of how individuals use spiritual concepts to avoid psychological development. This pattern involves using spiritual practices, beliefs, or experiences to circumvent the difficult work of integrating shadow material, developing emotional maturity, and addressing interpersonal conflicts that require conscious attention. Meditation practices may be used to escape rather than engage with difficult emotions. Forgiveness teachings may prevent appropriate anger about actual harm, and concepts of divine love may be used to avoid setting necessary boundaries in relationships. Jung observed that premature transcendence often leads to what appears to be spiritual development, but actually represents regression to infantile psychological states disguised in spiritual language. Authentic spiritual development requires engaging with rather than transcending human psychological complexity, using spiritual insights to enhance rather than replace psychological development and interpersonal competence. Contemporary therapeutic approaches increasingly recognize spiritual bypassing as a significant obstacle to both psychological and spiritual development, requiring integration of spiritual practice with psychological work that addresses the full range of human developmental needs. The problem of spiritual materialism in contemporary Western spirituality reflects what Jung identified as the tendency to approach spiritual development with the same consumerist mentality that characterizes Western approach to material goods. Spiritual seeking often becomes a form of shopping for experiences, teachers, and practices that provide immediate satisfaction while avoiding the long-term commitment and sustained effort that authentic spiritual development requires. This approach treats spirituality as a commodity to be acquired rather than a lifelong process of consciousness development that requires dedication, patience, and often considerable sacrifice of immediate gratification. Jung observed that genuine spiritual development follows natural developmental patterns that cannot be accelerated through technique, accumulation, or exotic practice adoption, requiring instead sustained attention to the gradual unfolding of psychological and spiritual maturation. Contemporary spiritual marketplaces often promote practices and teachings that promise rapid results while neglecting the foundational work of character development, ethical growth, and psychological integration that traditional spiritual traditions recognized as prerequisites for advanced spiritual development. Jung's emphasis on individuation as a lifelong process provides important corrective to contemporary expectations of immediate spiritual gratification, while offering realistic frameworks for understanding the extended time and effort required for genuine spiritual transformation. The cultural appropriation problems in contemporary Western spirituality reflect deeper issues about the relationship between spiritual practice and cultural context that Jung explored through his analysis of Eastern and Western psychological differences. Western practitioners often extract specific techniques or concepts from traditional spiritual systems, while ignoring the cultural, psychological, and ethical contexts that make such practices meaningful and safe. This approach may lead to superficial adoption of spiritual forms without understanding their deeper purposes or potential psychological effects, sometimes resulting in spiritual inflation, psychological instability, or cultural insensitivity. Jung argued that effective spiritual development requires understanding both universal archetypal patterns and particular cultural constitutions that shape how these patterns can be most appropriately accessed and integrated. Contemporary spiritual practitioners benefit from Jung's insights about the importance of finding spiritual approaches that honor both universal human spiritual needs and particular cultural and individual circumstances that influence how spiritual development can most effectively proceed. This requires discriminating appreciation for traditional spiritual wisdom, while also recognizing the need for culturally appropriate adaptation that serves contemporary psychological and spiritual needs without losing essential spiritual insights. Jung's alternative vision for authentic Western spirituality emphasized the importance of psychological sophistication, ethical development, and sustained commitment to consciousness development through engagement with both inner and outer challenges. He argued that Western spirituality needed to integrate insights from depth psychology about unconscious processes, shadow work, and the complexity of human motivation, while maintaining appreciation for transcendent spiritual realities. This integration would produce spirituality that addresses the full range of human developmental needs while avoiding both materialistic reductionism and otherworldly escapism. Jung's approach emphasized individual spiritual development that serves collective healing and cultural evolution rather than personal spiritual attainment that ignores social responsibility and interpersonal engagement. Contemporary movements towards spiritually integrated psychotherapy, contemplative activism, and various forms of engaged spirituality often reflect themes Jung identified as essential for authentic spiritual development in Western cultural contexts. However, Jung's vision of psychologically sophisticated and ethically grounded spirituality remains largely unrealized in contemporary spiritual movements, suggesting continued relevance of his critique and the ongoing need for integration of psychological and spiritual wisdom in approaches to human development and cultural healing. Part 16. Contemporary Empirical Research on Jung and Religion. Contemporary empirical research in psychology of religion has provided substantial support for many of Jung's insights about the psychological functions of religious experience, while also revealing limitations and areas requiring theoretical revision. Modern scientific methods allow researchers to study religious phenomena with greater precision than was available in Jung's time, using neuroimaging, cross-cultural surveys, longitudinal studies and sophisticated statistical analyses to examine the relationships between religious experience and psychological health. These studies have confirmed Jung's fundamental insight that religious involvement generally correlates with better mental health outcomes, though the mechanisms underlying these relationships prove more complex than Jung's theoretical framework alone can explain. Contemporary research also reveals individual differences in how religious experience affects psychological functioning, supporting Jung's emphasis on the importance of psychological type and individual constitutional factors in determining optimal spiritual approaches for different people. Neuroscientific research on religious and spiritual experience has provided new understanding of the brain mechanisms underlying what Jung called numinous experience and encounter with archetypal contents. Brain imaging studies reveal that mystical experiences, meditation states, and religious conversion involve activation of specific neural networks associated with self-transcendence, emotional regulation, and meaning-making processes. These findings support Jung's contention that religious experience reflects natural psychological processes rather than supernatural intervention, while also revealing the neurobiological basis for the profound psychological effects he observed in individuals undergoing spiritual transformation. Research on psychedelic experiences shows remarkable similarities to Jung's descriptions of archetypal encounters, including the appearance of religious imagery, encounters with autonomous spiritual beings, and lasting changes in personality and worldview that resemble outcomes of successful individuation. However, neuroscientific findings also suggest that Jung's theoretical explanations may require updating to incorporate current understanding of brain function, evolutionary psychology, and the relationship between consciousness and neural activity. Contemporary researchers increasingly recognize the value of Jung's phenomenological descriptions while seeking more precise scientific explanations for the mechanisms underlying religious experience and spiritual transformation. Cross-cultural research has largely confirmed Jung's hypothesis about universal archetypal patterns, while also revealing greater cultural variation in religious expression than his collective unconscious theory initially suggested. Anthropological studies document remarkable similarities in religious themes across cultures, including hero journeys, death and rebirth myths, divine marriage symbolism, and various representations of spiritual transformation that support Jung's archetypal theory. However, research also reveals that cultural factors significantly influence how archetypal patterns manifest in particular societies, suggesting that the relationship between universal psychological structures and cultural expression is more complex than Jung's early formulations recognized. Contemporary scholars increasingly emphasize the interaction between innate psychological predispositions and cultural learning in shaping religious experience, recognizing both universal human tendencies towards spiritual meaning, making and the crucial importance of cultural context in determining how these tendencies develop. This research supports modified versions of Jung's archetypal theory that incorporate greater attention to cultural influences while maintaining recognition of universal patterns in human spiritual development. Cross-cultural studies also confirm Jung's insight that healthy psychological development requires some form of relationship with meaning and transcendence, though the specific forms this relationship takes vary considerably across different cultural and religious contexts. Longitudinal studies of religious development across the lifespan have provided substantial support for Jung's insights about the relationship between spiritual experience and psychological maturation. Research confirms that spiritual concerns typically intensify during midlife transitions, supporting Jung's observation that individuation often begins in earnest during the second half of life. Studies of religious coping show that individuals who maintain some form of spiritual practice demonstrate greater resilience during times of crisis, illness and loss, confirming Jung's contention that religious experience serves crucial psychological functions. Research on wisdom development reveals that individuals who integrate spiritual insights with psychological maturity demonstrate enhanced capacity for complex thinking, emotional regulation, and interpersonal relationships throughout later life. However, longitudinal studies also reveal that the relationship between religious involvement and psychological health varies considerably depending on the type of religious practice, individual personality factors, and social context. Some forms of religious involvement correlate with better mental health outcomes, while others show no effect or even negative correlations, suggesting that Jung's generally positive assessment of religious experience requires qualification based on empirical evidence about which types of spiritual practice actually promote psychological development. Research on religious conversion and spiritual transformation has provided new insights into the psychological processes Jung described as individuation and self-realization. Studies of individuals undergoing significant spiritual changes reveal patterns of identity, reorganization, value clarification, and behavioral modification that resemble Jung's descriptions of archetypal encounters and personality transformation. Conversion experiences often involve what researchers call quantum change, sudden and lasting alterations in personality and worldview that occur during peak spiritual experiences. These findings support Jung's observation that authentic spiritual development can produce profound psychological transformation that exceeds the effects of conventional therapeutic interventions. However, research also reveals that sustainable spiritual transformation requires ongoing psychological work and social support rather than relying solely on peak experiences, confirming Jung's emphasis on individuation as a lifelong developmental process. Contemporary studies of spiritual direction, contemplative practice, and various forms of spiritual psychotherapy increasingly incorporate insights from both Jungian psychology and empirical research to develop evidence-based approaches to supporting spiritual development and psychological integration. Contemporary research on psychological type and religious preference has provided mixed support for Jung's theories about the relationship between personality and optimal spiritual approaches. Studies using validated measures of psychological type reveal some correlations between personality preferences and religious orientation, with introverted and intuitive types showing greater attraction to mystical and contemplative practices, while extroverted and sensing types preferring more active and communal forms of religious expression. However, the relationships prove less consistent than Jung's theoretical framework would predict, suggesting that factors beyond psychological type influence religious development and spiritual preference. Research on religious diversity within personality types reveals that individuals with similar psychological constitutions may pursue very different spiritual paths while achieving comparable levels of psychological integration and spiritual satisfaction. These findings support Jung's general insight that spiritual development must be individualized, while also suggesting that his specific theoretical formulations about the relationship between type and religious preference require modification based on empirical evidence. Contemporary approaches to spiritual guidance increasingly emphasize the importance of matching spiritual practices to individual temperament and developmental needs, while recognizing that such matching involves complex factors beyond psychological type alone. Part 17. Neuroscience and the validation of Jung's insights. Recent advances in neuroscience have provided remarkable validation for many of Jung's theoretical insights about the nature of consciousness, the structure of the psyche, and the psychological mechanisms underlying religious experience. Brain imaging technologies allow researchers to observe neural activity during meditation, prayer, mystical experiences, and various forms of spiritual practice, revealing specific brain networks and neurochemical processes that correspond to Jung's descriptions of numinous experience and archetypal encounters. These findings support Jung's contention that religious experience reflects natural psychological processes while providing scientific explanations for the profound transformative effects he observed in individuals undergoing spiritual development. Neuroscientific research also validates Jung's emphasis on the unconscious dimension of mental life, revealing that the vast majority of brain activity occurs below the threshold of conscious awareness, while significantly influencing conscious experience and behavior. Research on the default mode network has provided neurobiological evidence for what Jung called the ego complex and its relationship to broader patterns of self-organization in the brain. The default mode network consists of brain regions that activate during rest and self-referential thinking, corresponding to Jung's understanding of ego consciousness as a complex of associated contents organized around the sense of personal identity. Studies show that meditation, psychedelic experiences, and various forms of spiritual practice reduce default mode network activity while increasing connectivity between different brain regions, producing states of consciousness that transcend ordinary ego boundaries. These findings provide neural correlates for Jung's descriptions of self-encounters and individuation experiences that involve expansion of consciousness beyond ego limitations. Reduced default mode network activity during spiritual experiences corresponds to Jung's observation that authentic religious experience involves temporary dissolution of ego identification while maintaining conscious awareness. Contemporary neuroscientists increasingly recognize that healthy psychological development requires balance between ego functioning and access to broader patterns of consciousness organization that Jung associated with the self archetype. Neuroscientific studies of religious and mystical experience have revealed specific brain mechanisms underlying what Jung called the numinous quality of archetypal encounters. Research shows that profound spiritual experiences involve activation of temporal lobe structures associated with meaning attribution, emotional significance, and the sense of presence, corresponding to Jung's descriptions of numinous experience as encounters with autonomous psychological contents. Studies of individuals reporting mystical experiences reveal increased activity in brain regions associated with self-transcendence and unity consciousness, supporting Jung's insight that authentic spiritual experience involves expansion of identity beyond ordinary ego boundaries. Neurochemical research demonstrates that spiritual practices and mystical experiences involve changes in neurotransmitter systems associated with mood regulation, stress reduction, and enhanced cognitive flexibility. These findings provide biological explanations for the therapeutic effects Jung observed in individuals who developed authentic relationship with religious experience and archetypal contents. Contemporary research on the neuroscience of spirituality increasingly incorporates Jungian insights about the psychological significance of religious experience, while providing scientific understanding of the brain mechanisms underlying spiritual transformation and psychological healing. Research on memory consolidation and emotional processing has revealed neurobiological mechanisms that correspond to Jung's understanding of how archetypal contents influence psychological development. Studies show that emotionally significant experiences undergo special processing during sleep and dreaming that integrates new information with existing memory networks and emotional associations. This process corresponds to Jung's observation that archetypal encounters often occur through dreams and produce lasting changes in personality organization and behavioral patterns. Neuroscientific research on trauma processing reveals that therapeutic interventions must access emotional memory networks in the brain, rather than relying solely on cognitive understanding, supporting Jung's emphasis on the importance of working with symbolic and imaginal material in psychological healing. Studies of neuroplasticity demonstrate that intensive therapeutic work and spiritual practice can produce measurable changes in brain structure and function, providing biological validation for Jung's contention that individuation involves fundamental transformation of psychological organization. Contemporary approaches to trauma therapy increasingly incorporate insights from both neuroscience and Jungian psychology, recognizing that effective healing requires accessing unconscious memory networks while supporting conscious integration of traumatic material. Neuroscientific studies of creativity and insight have provided biological evidence for Jung's understanding of the transcendent function as a psychological mechanism that mediates between conscious and unconscious contents. Brain imaging research reveals that creative breakthroughs and sudden insights involve temporary suspension of analytical thinking combined with increased communication between normally disconnected brain regions. This pattern corresponds to Jung's description of the transcendent function as a process that allows unconscious wisdom to inform conscious understanding through symbolic and metaphorical thinking. Studies of artistic creativity show that individuals accessing inspiration and creative flow demonstrate brain activity patterns similar to those observed during meditation and mystical experience, supporting Jung's insight that creative expression provides access to archetypal contents and transpersonal dimensions of consciousness. Research on problem-solving and decision-making reveals that complex challenges often require integration of rational analysis with intuitive insight, confirming Jung's emphasis on the importance of balancing conscious and unconscious approaches to psychological and spiritual development. Contemporary neuroscience increasingly recognizes the value of approaches that facilitate access to unconscious processing while maintaining conscious discrimination and critical thinking capacity. The emerging field of neurotheology attempts to understand religious experience through neuroscientific investigation while respecting its spiritual significance, reflecting Jung's approach of studying religious phenomena scientifically without reducing them to purely material processes. Research in this field reveals that religious practices produce measurable changes in brain function that correlate with reported improvements in psychological well-being, emotional regulation, and social connectedness. These findings support Jung's contention that religious experience serves important psychological functions, while also suggesting that spiritual practices may have therapeutic applications in clinical settings. However, neuroscientific research also raises important questions about the relationship between brain activity and subjective spiritual experience that Jung's theoretical framework alone cannot fully address. Contemporary scholars increasingly recognize the need for interdisciplinary approaches that integrate neuroscientific findings with psychological insights and phenomenological descriptions of spiritual experience. Jung's emphasis on the psychological reality and therapeutic significance of religious experience continues to provide valuable frameworks for understanding neuroscientific findings while avoiding both materialistic reductionism and uncritical acceptance of supernatural explanations for spiritual phenomena. Part 18. Jung's influence on contemporary spirituality and therapy. Jung's psychological insights about religion have profoundly influenced contemporary approaches to spirituality, psychotherapy, and the integration of psychological and spiritual development in ways that continue to expand and evolve. His emphasis on the natural religious function of the psyche has provided theoretical foundation for spiritually integrated therapeutic approaches that recognize spiritual experience as potentially beneficial rather than automatically pathological. Contemporary psychotherapy increasingly incorporates attention to clients' spiritual concerns, meaning-making processes, and relationship with transcendent reality as legitimate dimensions of psychological health, rather than topics to be avoided in secular therapeutic contexts. Jung's insights about individuation have also influenced various forms of contemporary spirituality that emphasize personal spiritual development, direct experience of the sacred, and integration of psychological and spiritual growth rather than reliance on external religious authorities or traditional doctrinal systems. The development of transpersonal psychology as a distinct field within psychology represents one of the most significant extensions of Jung's work on religion and spirituality. Transpersonal psychologists study spiritual experiences, altered states of consciousness, and various forms of transcendent awareness using scientific methods while maintaining appreciation for their potential value in human development. This field incorporates Jung's insights about archetypes, the collective unconscious, and the individualization process while also drawing on contemporary research in consciousness studies, neuroscience, and cross-cultural spirituality. Transpersonal therapeutic approaches often use techniques derived from Jung's work, including active imagination, dream analysis, and attention to synchronistic events, while also incorporating methods from various contemplative traditions and indigenous healing practices. Contemporary transpersonal psychology continues to grapple with Jung's fundamental challenge of studying spiritual phenomena scientifically while respecting their subjective significance and potential transformative value. This field represents an attempt to fulfill Jung's vision of a psychology that takes religious experience seriously while maintaining scientific rigor and avoiding dogmatic adherence to particular spiritual or religious systems. Spiritually integrated psychotherapy has emerged as a significant movement within mainstream psychology that incorporates insights from Jung and other depth psychologists about the relationship between psychological and spiritual development. Therapists working in this approach recognize that many psychological problems reflect spiritual concerns, including loss of meaning, disconnection from sources of transcendence, and inability to find purpose and direction in life. Such therapeutic approaches often incorporate techniques for working with dreams, exploring life meaning, and addressing existential concerns while maintaining appropriate boundaries and professional objectivity. Jung's insights about the therapeutic value of religious experience have influenced training programs for psychologists and counselors who work with religiously oriented clients or individuals seeking to integrate spiritual and psychological development. Contemporary research on spiritually integrated therapy demonstrates its effectiveness for treating various psychological problems while also supporting clients' spiritual growth and meaning-making processes. However, this field continues to struggle with questions about the appropriate boundaries between psychotherapy and spiritual direction, the training required for therapists to work competently with spiritual material, and the integration of secular therapeutic methods with spiritual wisdom from various traditions. Contemporary spirituality movements often reflect themes that Jung identified as essential for authentic spiritual development in modern cultural contexts. Many individuals seek spiritual approaches that emphasize direct experience rather than institutional authority, psychological sophistication rather than naive acceptance of traditional beliefs, and integration with contemporary scientific understanding rather than rejection of rational inquiry. New Age spirituality, despite its limitations and potential for spiritual bypassing that Jung anticipated, often incorporates his insights about the importance of individual spiritual development, the value of working with dreams and symbols, and the need for integrating psychological and spiritual growth. Progressive forms of traditional religion increasingly emphasize themes Jung advocated, including greater attention to mystical experience, recognition of the psychological dimensions of spiritual development, and appreciation for spiritual wisdom from multiple traditions rather than exclusive reliance on single doctrinal systems. Contemporary contemplative movements often incorporate practices that facilitate direct encounter with what Jung called archetypal contents, while maintaining critical discrimination about the interpretation and application of spiritual insights. However, Jung's warnings about spiritual inflation, bypassing, and the need for ethical grounding remain highly relevant for evaluating the authenticity and psychological healthiness of various contemporary spiritual movements and practices. Jung's influence on pastoral care and spiritual direction has led to significant developments in how religious professionals understand and support individual spiritual development. Many clergy and spiritual directors now receive training in basic psychological principles, recognizing that effective spiritual guidance requires understanding of human development, family dynamics, and various psychological factors that influence spiritual growth. This psychological sophistication helps religious professionals distinguish between spiritual issues and psychological problems, while also recognizing their frequent interconnection and mutual influence. Jung's insights about individuation have influenced approaches to spiritual direction that emphasize supporting individuals' authentic spiritual development rather than conformity to external religious expectations or institutional requirements. Contemporary pastoral care increasingly incorporates attention to dreams, life transitions, and meaning-making processes as legitimate dimensions of spiritual development, rather than focusing exclusively on moral instruction or doctrinal education. However, the integration of psychological and spiritual approaches in religious settings continues to raise questions about professional boundaries, the relationship between pastoral care and psychotherapy, and the training needed for religious professionals to work effectively with individuals' psychological and spiritual development needs. The ongoing influence of Jung's work on religion and spirituality can be seen in contemporary research programs, therapeutic innovations, and spiritual movements that continue to explore the relationship between psychological and spiritual development. Researchers in psychology of religion increasingly incorporate Jungian insights about the psychological functions of religious experience while using contemporary scientific methods to test and refine his theoretical formulations. New therapeutic approaches continue to emerge that integrate depth psychological insights with various contemplative traditions, creating innovative methods for supporting both psychological healing and spiritual development. Contemporary spiritual teachers and writers often draw explicitly or implicitly on Jung's insights about individuation, archetypal psychology, and the integration of conscious and unconscious dimensions of human experience. Academic programs in spirituality studies, religious studies, and psychology increasingly include study of Jung's contributions to understanding religion and spirituality as foundational material for students seeking to work professionally in these fields. Jung's vision of a psychology that takes spiritual experience seriously while maintaining scientific rigor continues to influence efforts to develop more comprehensive approaches to human development that address both psychological and spiritual dimensions of human flourishing and cultural healing. Part 19. Criticisms and limitations of Jung's religious psychology. Despite the substantial influence and continuing relevance of Jung's insights about religion and spirituality, his work has faced significant criticism from multiple perspectives that highlight important limitations and areas requiring theoretical revision. These criticisms come from empirical psychologists who question the scientific validity of concepts like the collective unconscious and archetypes, theologians who challenge his psychological reductionism of religious experience, feminist scholars who critique his gender essentialism, and cross-cultural researchers who question the universality of his archetypal claims. Understanding these criticisms is essential for appropriating Jung's insights responsibly, while avoiding uncritical acceptance of theoretical formulations that may reflect historical limitations, cultural biases, or insufficient empirical support. Contemporary applications of Jungian insights to religion and spirituality benefit from addressing these criticisms constructively while preserving valuable aspects of his contributions to understanding psychological and spiritual development. The empirical scientific critique focuses primarily on the lack of testable hypotheses and measurable evidence for Jung's core theoretical concepts, including the collective unconscious, archetypes, and synchronicity. Mainstream psychology has largely rejected these concepts as unscientific speculation that cannot be studied using rigorous research methods or validated through controlled experimentation. Critics argue that Jung's approach relies too heavily on subjective interpretation of symbolic material, anecdotal evidence from clinical practice, and philosophical speculation rather than systematic empirical investigation. The concept of archetypes has been criticized as unfalsifiable, meaning that any evidence can be interpreted as supporting archetypal theory, while no possible evidence could definitively refute it. Contemporary cognitive psychology and evolutionary psychology offer alternative explanations for cross-cultural similarities in religious and mythological themes that rely on natural selection, cultural transmission, and universal features of human cognitive architecture rather than inherited psychological contents. However, some researchers argue that dismissing Jung's insights entirely may be premature, as neuroscientific findings about consciousness, memory, and spiritual experience increasingly support aspects of his theoretical framework, even if his specific explanatory mechanisms require revision. Theological criticisms of Jung's approach to religion focus on his tendency to psychologize spiritual experience in ways that may reduce transcendent reality to psychological phenomena. Religious scholars argue that Jung's insistence on studying religious experience psychologically rather than metaphysically fails to take seriously the truth claims that religious traditions make about divine reality, revelation, and salvation. Critics contend that interpreting religious symbols as expressions of archetypal psychology rather than divine communication fundamentally misunderstands the nature of authentic religious experience and may undermine faith by suggesting that spiritual encounters reflect internal psychological processes rather than external divine intervention. Some theologians argue that Jung's emphasis on individual spiritual development conflicts with religious traditions' emphasis on collective worship, communal authority, and submission to divine will as revealed through established religious institutions. However, other religious scholars appreciate Jung's contributions to understanding the psychological dimensions of spiritual development, while maintaining that psychological insights can complement rather than replace theological understanding of religious experience. Contemporary dialogue between psychology and theology increasingly seeks to integrate psychological and spiritual perspectives without reducing either to the other, recognizing that both offer valuable but different approaches to understanding human spiritual experience and development. Feminist criticisms of Jung's psychology focus particularly on his understanding of gender, anima and animus concepts, and his tendency to essentialize masculine and feminine characteristics in ways that may reinforce rather than challenge traditional gender stereotypes. Critics argue that Jung's descriptions of anima and animus reflect cultural gender assumptions from his historical period rather than universal psychological truths, potentially perpetuating limiting beliefs about gender roles and capabilities. Some feminist scholars contend that Jung's emphasis on integrating masculine and feminine psychological functions still operates within a binary gender framework that fails to recognize the full complexity and diversity of gender identity and expression. Critics also note that Jung's theoretical framework was developed primarily through work with privileged European clients and may not adequately address the experiences of women, people of colour, and individuals from different cultural backgrounds or socio-economic circumstances. However, some feminist theorists have found value in Jung's insights about psychological integration, while advocating for revisions that eliminate gender essentialism and expand understanding of psychological development beyond traditional masculine and feminine categories. Contemporary applications of Jungian psychology increasingly emphasize individual differences and cultural diversity rather than universal gender categories, recognizing that psychological development involves integration of various human capacities regardless of their traditional association with masculine or feminine characteristics. Cross-cultural criticisms challenge Jung's claims about the universality of archetypal patterns, and question whether his theoretical framework adequately accounts for cultural diversity in religious and spiritual expression. Anthropological research reveals significant variation in religious themes across cultures that may not fit easily into Jung's archetypal categories, suggesting that cultural factors play a larger role in shaping spiritual experience than his collective unconscious theory acknowledges. Critics argue that Jung's archetypal interpretations may reflect Western philosophical and religious assumptions that are inappropriately projected onto other cultures' spiritual traditions and practices. Some scholars contend that Jung's emphasis on individual spiritual development reflects specifically Western values of individualism and autonomy that may conflict with more communal and collective approaches to spirituality found in many non-Western cultures. Cross-cultural researchers also note that Jung's limited direct experience with non-Western cultures may have led to oversimplified or romanticized interpretations of Eastern religious traditions that fail to recognize their complexity and diversity. However, other scholars argue that while Jung's specific theoretical formulations may require cultural modification, his basic insights about universal human needs for meaning, transcendence, and spiritual development remain valuable for understanding religious experience across cultures when applied with appropriate cultural sensitivity and contextual awareness. Contemporary responses to these criticisms increasingly emphasize the importance of maintaining Jung's valuable insights while updating his theoretical framework based on advances in scientific understanding, cultural awareness, and empirical research. Modern applications of Jungian psychology to religion and spirituality often focus on his phenomenological descriptions of spiritual experience and therapeutic insights about psychological development, while remaining agnostic about his specific theoretical explanations for these phenomena. Researchers continue to find value in Jung's emphasis on the psychological significance of religious experience, the importance of meaning-making in mental health, and the therapeutic potential of working with symbolic and imaginal material. Contemporary scholars increasingly recognize that Jung's contributions can be appreciated and applied without requiring complete acceptance of his theoretical system, allowing for selective appropriation of useful insights while rejecting or revising problematic aspects of his work. This approach enables continued development of Jung's insights about religion and spirituality while addressing legitimate criticisms and incorporating advances in contemporary psychological, theological, and cross-cultural understanding. The ongoing vitality of Jung's influence on psychology, spirituality, and therapy suggests that his core insights about the psychological dimensions of religious experience continue to offer valuable resources for understanding human development despite the limitations and problems that critics have identified in his specific theoretical formulations. Part 20. Jung's Legacy and the Future of Psychology and Religion. Carl Jung's revolutionary approach to understanding the relationship between psychology and religion has established a foundation for continued exploration of spiritual dimensions of human experience that transcends the limitations of his particular theoretical formulations, while preserving his essential insights about the psychological significance of religious phenomena. His fundamental recognition that humans possess a natural religious function requiring relationship with meaning and transcendence has become increasingly accepted within mainstream psychology, leading to greater integration of spiritual concerns in therapeutic practice and mental health research. Contemporary developments in neuroscience, consciousness studies, and cross-cultural psychology continue to validate many of Jung's observations while providing more sophisticated explanations for the mechanisms underlying spiritual experience and religious development. The future of psychology and religion will likely build upon Jung's foundation while incorporating advances in scientific understanding, cultural awareness, and therapeutic innovation that address both the strengths and limitations of his pioneering work. The integration of psychological and spiritual approaches to human development represents one of Jung's most enduring contributions that continues to influence contemporary therapeutic practice, spiritual guidance, and academic research. Mental health professionals increasingly recognize that purely secular approaches to therapy may be insufficient for addressing existential concerns, meaning-making needs, and spiritual dimensions of psychological problems that affect many individuals seeking help. This recognition has led to development of spiritually integrated therapeutic approaches that incorporate attention to clients' religious and spiritual concerns while maintaining professional boundaries and scientific rigor. Contemporary training programs for psychologists, counselors, and clergy increasingly emphasize the importance of understanding both psychological and spiritual dimensions of human development, reflecting Jung's insight that effective helping requires appreciation for the full complexity of human experience. Research on spiritually integrated therapy continues to demonstrate its effectiveness for various psychological problems while also supporting individuals' spiritual growth and meaning-making processes. The future development of this field will likely involve continued refinement of methods for integrating psychological and spiritual insights while addressing ethical concerns, professional boundaries, and the training needed for competent practice in this complex area. Jung's emphasis on the importance of individual spiritual development rather than conformity to external religious authorities has profoundly influenced contemporary spirituality movements and progressive approaches to traditional religion. Many contemporary individuals seek spiritual paths that honor both scientific understanding and spiritual insight, emphasize direct experience rather than institutional authority, and support psychological development alongside spiritual growth. This trend reflects Jung's vision of spirituality that serves individuation rather than collective conformity, though it also raises questions about the relationship between individual spiritual development and participation in religious communities that provide collective wisdom and social support. Contemporary religious institutions increasingly grapple with balancing respect for individual spiritual journeys with maintenance of communal identity and traditional wisdom, often incorporating psychological insights about human development into their approaches to religious education and spiritual guidance. The future of religion may increasingly involve synthesis of traditional wisdom with contemporary psychological understanding, creating forms of spirituality that serve both individual development and collective flourishing while maintaining connection with historical spiritual insights. Jung's insights about the psychological foundations of religious experience provide valuable resources for navigating these developments while avoiding both individualistic spirituality that ignores collective wisdom and institutional religion that suppresses individual spiritual development. Contemporary neuroscience research continues to validate and extend Jung's insights about the psychological mechanisms underlying religious experience, while providing more precise explanations for phenomena he described through psychological theory. Brain imaging studies reveal specific neural networks involved in spiritual experience, mystical states, and meaning-making processes that correspond to Jung's descriptions of numinous encounter and archetypal activation. Research on consciousness, meditation, and psychedelic experiences increasingly supports Jung's emphasis on the therapeutic potential of accessing non-ordinary states of consciousness that provide expanded perspective on psychological and spiritual development. These scientific advances create opportunities for developing more effective methods for facilitating spiritual experience and psychological transformation, while also raising questions about the relationship between brain activity and subjective spiritual reality that Jung's theoretical framework alone cannot fully address. Future research in this area will likely continue integrating neuroscientific findings with phenomenological descriptions of spiritual experience, therapeutic insights about psychological development, and cross-cultural studies of religious phenomena. Such interdisciplinary approaches reflect Jung's vision of scientific psychology that takes spiritual experience seriously while maintaining empirical rigor and avoiding both materialistic reductionism and uncritical acceptance of supernatural explanations for psychological phenomena. The ongoing relevance of Jung's insights for addressing contemporary cultural and global challenges suggests that his work will continue to influence future developments in psychology, spirituality, and social healing. His understanding of collective shadow projection provides valuable frameworks for analyzing political conflicts, ethnic violence, and various forms of social oppression that involve unconscious projection of unwanted psychological contents onto designated enemy groups. Jung's insights about the need for individual psychological development to serve collective healing remain highly relevant for addressing contemporary problems, including environmental destruction, social inequality, and cultural polarization that require both personal transformation and systemic change. His emphasis on the importance of meaning and transcendence for psychological health offers resources for addressing widespread problems of depression, anxiety, and spiritual emptiness that appear to be increasing in developed societies despite material prosperity. Future applications of Jung's insights will likely involve continued development of approaches that integrate individual psychological work with social action, spiritual development with practical engagement, and depth psychological understanding with contemporary scientific and therapeutic innovations. The vision of psychology that serves both individual flourishing and collective wisdom continues to inspire researchers, therapists, and spiritual teachers seeking more comprehensive approaches to human development and cultural healing. Jung's ultimate legacy lies in his demonstration that psychology and religion need not be antagonistic, but can be mutually enriching domains of human inquiry and development. His work established that scientific psychology can study religious phenomena respectfully and productively, while religious traditions can benefit from psychological insights about human development and spiritual formation. This integration continues to develop through various contemporary movements, including transpersonal psychology, spiritually integrated therapy, contemplative neuroscience, and progressive approaches to religious education and spiritual guidance. The challenges Jung identified regarding the relationship between individual spiritual development and collective religious wisdom remain relevant for contemporary efforts to create forms of spirituality that serve both personal growth and social healing. His insights about the psychological foundations of religious experience provide ongoing resources for understanding human spiritual needs, while developing culturally appropriate and psychologically sophisticated approaches to supporting spiritual development in diverse contemporary contexts. The future of psychology and religion will likely continue building upon Jung's foundation while addressing contemporary challenges including cultural diversity, scientific advances, global interconnection, and the need for spiritual approaches that contribute to, rather than detract from, human flourishing and environmental sustainability. Carl Jung's revolutionary insights about the psychological dimensions of religious experience have fundamentally transformed our understanding of human spirituality, while establishing foundations for continued exploration that will undoubtedly yield new discoveries about the depths of human consciousness and the universal human quest for meaning, wholeness, and transcendence. His vision of a psychology that honors both scientific rigor and spiritual wisdom continues to inspire those seeking more complete understanding of human nature and more effective approaches to promoting both individual development and collective healing. The conversation between psychology and religion that Jung initiated remains vibrant and essential for addressing the full complexity of human experience and the profound questions that have always driven the human search for understanding, healing, and transformation.